Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we wander candlelit corridors soaked in history and shadow, where whispers of power echo from stone walls and a crown weighs heavier than most could ever bear. We'll step through the thick mists of Tudor England to meet a woman who reigned for just 5 years, yet left behind a legacy that smoulders centuries later. Flickering torches dance in the rain, illuminating a woman in crimson velvet, flanked by clergy and courtiers. The chill of autumn clings to London as bells toll and crowds murmur. Her face is pale, unreadable, eyes too knowing for someone merely 40, but her spine remains straight. She is Mary Tudor, and she's about to make history as the first woman to rule England in her own right. But fair warning, they probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Mary's coronation takes place on a grey October morning in 1553, but the mood outside Westminster Abbey is anything but dull. Thousands cram into the streets, umbrellas and cloaks battling the damp chill. Eyes turn toward the gilded procession slowly making its way through London. The city has seen coronations before. Henry VIII's was a boisterous festival of meats, masks and jousts, but this is different. This is a queen regnant, not a queen consort, a woman crowned not by virtue of marriage, but by blood and sheer political resilience. Inside the abbey, tapestries of saints and angels drape every visible surface, the heady scent of incense curling above the crowd. Latin prayers echo as bishops place the heavy crown of St. Edward on her head. At that moment, history holds its breath. England, a nation shaped by male dominance and dynastic urgency, now bows before a daughter of the very king who once tore the kingdom in half to avoid having one. The coronation robes are tailored from thick crimson velvet, lined with ermine and dazzling with gold embroidery, no expense spared. The orb and sceptre are nearly comical in size, as if designed with broader shoulders in mind. Mary grips them tightly nonetheless, knowing full well that many of her subjects see this ceremony as a mistake, or at best a temporary aberration, and yet no one dares look away. For better or worse, the die has been cast. Though the ceremony follows tradition, Mary adds a few unmistakable Catholic touches. Latin chants and the Old Mass are back in full force, with the Eucharist offered as the literal body of Christ, heresy under her brother's short-lived reign. It's a statement, one that sends shivers through both devout Catholics and nervous Protestants. The message is unmistakable. The old ways are returning. Still, in this moment of pageantry and incense, few can predict just how stormy her reign will become. Her closest allies whisper of loyalty, but behind the oaths lie shifting eyes and careful calculations. Across the Channel, King Charles V of Spain, her cousin, watches with interest, and in England's taverns, drinkers debate whether this new queen will bring revival or ruin. Let's not sugarcoat it. The nation is a mess. Economically, England is sputtering. Harvests have failed, inflation is up, and the coinage is so debased it might as well be chocolate. Politically, factions are sharpening their daggers behind velvet curtains. Religiously, the nation is bitterly divided. Half the kingdom sees Mary as the rightful heir, the promised daughter of Catherine of Aragon and the sacred old faith. The other half sees her as a dangerous throwback, a Catholic puppet of the Pope, or worse, Spain. To say the atmosphere is tense would be like calling the Tower of London cosy, and Mary knows it. She may be soft-spoken and devout, but she is not naive. Decades of court intrigue have carved steel into her spine. It's also worth remembering how she got here, because Mary's path to the crown wasn't a royal promenade but a dramatic tug-of-war. Just months before her coronation, she had to fight for the throne, dodging an attempted usurpation orchestrated by the powerful Duke of Northumberland. He'd pushed forward Lady Jane Grey, Mary's cousin and a Protestant teenager, as queen, hoping to keep the throne safely Protestant. For 9 days Jane reigned, while Mary rallied supporters from East Anglia. Nobles wavered, soldiers picked sides. The common people as always leaned toward legitimacy, and when the dust cleared, Mary rode into London as a conquering queen. That moment, triumphant, breathless. feels fresh in the minds of the crowd as they watch her crowned. But beneath the velvet and the victory lies something more complicated. A woman who had once been stripped of her title, declared illegitimate and relegated to political obscurity by her own father. A woman who saw her mother banished, her faith outlawed, and her future reduced to rumour. To her, this crown is not just metal and jewels, it is vindication. But vindication has a short shelf life in Tudor England. Even as the choir sings and nobles kneel, Mary knows her reign will be anything but restful. Already whispers swirl through the court. Who will she marry? Will she restore Catholicism by fire or by pen? Can she produce an heir? And if not, will her Protestant sister Elizabeth take her place? These aren't idle questions. They are survival strategies. As festivities unfold, foreign ambassadors scribble notes to their monarchs. Some describe Mary as pious and resolute. Others find her aloof, even severe. One Spanish envoy calls her eyes melancholy but fierce. He's not wrong. Beneath the solemn piety, Mary possesses a deeply human blend of trauma, faith and ambition. She has learned to trust few. Her closest friend is her old governess, and even within her privy council, loyalties are paper-thin. Her cousin Charles V may support her, but his advice often serves Spanish interests first. Mary walks a tightrope suspended between papal Rome and Protestant England, with wolves snapping at both ankles. Outside the palace, Londoners party half-heartedly. Bonfires are lit, ale flows, there's theatre, music, even a tightrope walker in the square. But among the working class, opinions remain split. Older folk recall her mother, the devout Queen Catherine, and feel reassured. But younger Londoners, raised under Protestant reform, grumble into their tankards. Change is coming, and not everyone's ready to say their prayers in Latin again. Even the weather seems unsure how to feel. The grey sky spits rain, then clears, then rains again, rains. The Thames laps sluggishly at its banks, reflecting flickers of firelight and the occasional floating fish. Somewhere, in the back alley of a pub, someone probably coins the nickname Bloody Mary, though that moniker won't fully latch on for years. For now, she is simply Queen Mary, a queen by right, not by marriage. A woman with the weight of centuries on her shoulders and a kingdom pulling at the seams. As night deepens and the last lanterns gutter out in Whitehall, Mary retreats to her private chapel. Alone, she kneels before the altar, whispering prayers in Latin, fingers curled around a worn rosary. Her voice is steady, but her breath is shallow. She knows better than anyone. The crown grants power, not peace. And England, dear listener, is about to put that truth to the test. In the flickering twilight of royal infancy, Mary Tudor is born beneath a gilded canopy in Greenwich Palace on February 18th, 1516. Her birth, though celebrated with trumpets and feasting, comes as something of a bittersweet triumph. King Henry VIII, desperate for a son to secure the Tudor dynasty, welcomes his daughter with tempered joy, masking his disappointment behind lavish pageantry. Yet Catherine of Aragon, Henry's Spanish-born queen, beams with quiet satisfaction. Mary is healthy, pink-cheeked, and immediately swaddled in silk and hope. From the beginning, Mary's childhood straddles the tightrope between indulgence and expectation. She is the first and only surviving child after Catherine's string of miscarriages and infant deaths. That grim repetition of loss makes Mary not just precious, but essential. The Tudor court showers her with affection, tutors, and opulence. By age 4, she's fluent in Latin and beginning to pick apart Greek. At 5, she plays the virginals to polite applause. Visitors from abroad marvel at her wit and composure. She is the pearl of the kingdom, one Venetian ambassador writes. And indeed, little Mary sparkles, eager to please, born to rule, and still unaware that her world will one day collapse like pastry beneath a royal thumb. At court, Mary is often dressed like a miniature queen. Velvet gowns trail behind her as she toddles through corridors heavy with incense and intrigue. Her mother Catherine is a strong presence, intelligent, devout, politically astute. She shapes Mary not just with affection, but with a Catholic conscience as deep as the English Channel. Catherine insists that her daughter's education rival that of any prince, and so Mary grows up reading Cicero and Aquinas alongside the Psalms. Her penmanship is impeccable. Her memory, frighteningly good. Court jesters and musicians fill her days, but always within the scaffolding of purpose. Mary is taught that she is both royal and righteous, her position ordained not just by birth but by divine favour. For the first decade of her life, the path ahead seems clear. She may not be a son, but she is a prize. A marriageable princess with ties to both England and Spain. Her value is immense. That promise materialises early. By age 6, she's betrothed to the Dauphin of France. When that alliance fizzles, she's matched to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, her own cousin. That match also dissolves like fog at sunrise, but for a time, Mary is the linchpin of Europe's most coveted alliances. The weight of diplomacy sits on her tiny shoulders like a second crown. Then comes the slow unravelling. As Mary approaches adolescence, her mother's position grows perilous. Catherine's inability to provide a male heir begins to gnaw at Henry's pride and his patience. When Anne Boleyn enters the court orbit sly and magnetic, the entire game changes. Henry begins pursuing an annulment from Catherine, invoking Levitical law and stretching legal logic until it screams. But the Pope refuses to grant the annulment. Catherine resists. Rome digs in its heels. Mary, barely into her teens, watches it all unfold with growing dread. Her lessons continue, her status does not. Suddenly, invitations to court lessen. Her jewels are returned. The silks are swapped for modest woolens. She's declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, and moved from her own household to serve in the retinue of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. It's hard to overstate the humiliation. A girl born to wear a crown now bows to a baby in lace. She is forbidden from seeing her mother. She's told to renounce her title of princess and acknowledge her father's new marriage. When she refuses, she's punished with isolation. Her letters are read. Her rooms are searched. At 15, Mary is essentially under house arrest, a political ghost haunting her own lineage. Catherine of Aragon, banished and ailing, continues to write to her daughter, urging her to stay true to their Catholic faith. The two women, once central to England's identity, are now relics of a fading order. Yet Mary refuses to yield. Though physically frail, she suffers from headaches, stomach ailments and vision issues, her spirit remains unbowed. She keeps a rosary hidden in her bodice. She mutters Latin prayers in corners. She refuses to eat meat on Fridays. Her defiance, though quiet, is dangerous. To Henry and Anne, it is treason cloaked in piety. Historians still argue whether Mary's stubbornness was pure devotion or shrewd self-preservation. Either way, it carves her character in stone. In those lonely teenage years, she becomes something more than a displaced princess. She becomes an emblem for Catholics, for women denied power, for anyone forced to survive the whims of kings. Her health declines under the strain. Her once rosy cheeks fade to parchment. She begins to tremble during court appearances, but she never breaks. When ordered to sign a document renouncing her claim to legitimacy, she hesitates for days. Eventually, cornered and cut off from all support, she signs. But the ink barely dries before she retreats inward, spiritually unswayed. Meanwhile, Henry's court transforms into a carousel of wives and whispers. Anne Boleyn gives birth to Elizabeth, but fails to provide a son. She's soon accused of adultery and executed. Jane Seymour follows, and finally gives Henry a male heir, Edward VI, before dying of postnatal complications. Catherine Howard dances her way into the king's affections, only to meet the same blade as Anne. By the time Henry marries his final queen, Catherine Parr, the king is bloated, bitter, and plagued by ulcers. Throughout this turbulence, Mary keeps a low profile. Catherine Parr, herself a reform-minded Protestant, extends an olive branch. She invites Mary and Elizabeth back to court, encouraging familial healing. There are awkward dinners, stilted conversations, and smiles too tight to be sincere. But Mary, now in her 20s, understands the value of pretense. She plays the role, demure, obedient, gracious. But behind her lowered eyes, the fire still burns. When Henry dies in 1547, Mary weeps publicly, but likely exhales privately. Her half-brother Edward VI, just 9 years old, becomes king. Real power falls to his regents, especially the Duke of Somerset and later the Duke of Northumberland. They push England further into Protestant reform, mandating English-language Bibles, abolishing the Mass and criminalising Catholic rituals. Mary, still devout, finds herself increasingly at odds with the law. Now 31, unmarried and without political allies, Mary could easily retreat into genteel obscurity, but she doesn't. Instead, she doubles down. She continues attending secret masses. She writes to the Emperor Charles V, asking for support. She refuses to convert. At one point, when royal envoys attempt to remove her chapel's Catholic artefacts, she locks the doors and dares them to touch a single relic. It's a miracle, some say, that she isn't imprisoned, or worse. But Mary has become a symbol. Her existence reminds England that the old religion hasn't died, and while Edward's government tries to erase the past, Mary carries it quietly within her, like smouldering incense beneath a stone altar. And so she waits. Through sickness and summons, through interrogations and icy court receptions, Mary waits. Each year, Edward grows weaker. The boy king, pale and coughing, becomes increasingly gaunt. Rumours swirl, consumption, poison porridge, divine punishment. Whatever the cause, by 1553 it's clear he won't live long. The question of succession rears its hydra heads. Edward, fearful of a Catholic restoration, names Lady Jane Grey his heir. She is young, well-educated, and most importantly, Protestant. The plan is endorsed by Northumberland and a cabal of Protestant lords. When Edward dies in July, Jane is proclaimed Queen. Mary, on her estate in East Anglia, receives the news with a tight-lipped smile, and then she moves. Gathering loyal nobles, armed supporters, and local militia, Mary marches on London. Villagers line the roads, waving palm leaves and crosses. Former enemies pledge allegiance. Within days, Jane's fragile claim crumbles. Even the Royal Navy defects to Mary. On July 19th, 1553, Mary is officially proclaimed Queen. Bells ring, crowds cheer, and Jane is quietly escorted to the Tower of London. In less than 2 weeks, Mary has reclaimed a crown denied her for 2 decades. The child once stripped of her title now wears the sceptre of England. The girl who watched her mother die in exile now commands the court that banished them both. And yet, the smile she wears at her coronation never quite reaches her eyes. By the time the velvet coronation cushions are packed away and the golden trumpets silenced, Mary Tudor sits alone at the centre of an uneasy kingdom. She has pulled off the impossible, seizing the throne without bloodshed, toppling a rival regime, and restoring legitimacy to her long-disputed claim. Yet the real test lies ahead. In the cool shadow of Westminster, she is queen not just by name, but by deed. And the crown she fought so long to wear now tightens with every breath. Her first challenge: what to do with Lady Jane Grey. Jane, the teenage 9 days queen, remains confined in the Tower of London. History has painted Jane in pastel tones, a meek, bookish pawn forced into power. But Mary knows the truth is thornier. Jane may be young, but the decision to claim the crown wasn't hers alone. The Duke of Northumberland, Jane's father-in-law and a towering figure in Edward's Protestant government, orchestrated the coup. Jane's name was the ribbon on the package, but the package itself was treason. Still, Mary hesitates. Executing a teenager, especially one with royal blood, would set a chilling tone. It's also bad optics, decidedly unqueenly in the eyes of European courts. For now, she lets Jane live. The Duke of Northumberland, on the other hand, is not so lucky. Within weeks, he's led to the executioner's block and meets the blade with a prayer in Latin. A last-minute pivot to Catholicism that feels more strategic than sincere. Mary enters her first parliament that fall with a steady step and a clear agenda. She wants to undo the Protestant reforms of the previous reigns. That means repealing the religious statutes passed under Edward VI, restoring the Mass, and returning the Church of England to papal authority. She speaks softly, formally, but with undeniable resolve. Many in the house are stunned. They had hoped she might maintain a middle path, a little Latin here, a little communion wafer there. Instead, Mary goes full tilt. She isn't just rewriting law, she's resurrecting a lost world. Among the people, reactions are mixed. Some cheer the return of Catholic rituals, the familiar smells of frankincense, the glow of candles, the sombre grandeur of Latin liturgy. For the older generation, it feels like homecoming. But for the young, those who grew up under Protestant sermons and vernacular Bibles, it's a strange regression, like stepping into a painting they were taught to scorn. Historians still debate how much of Mary's restoration was popular versus imposed. Some towns openly embrace the shift, rebuilding altars and repainting over whitewashed saints. Others muttered and dragged their feet. In London, where reformist sentiment runs deepest, churchgoers begin skipping services, claiming illness or business. Protestant preachers retreat to private homes holding secret sermons by candlelight. And yet for now, Mary moves cautiously. She restores the old heresy acts, but they remain dormant. No one burns, not yet. Meanwhile, the question looms like smoke over a quiet hearth. Whom will she marry? At 37, Mary is no longer a springtime bride. But marriage isn't just personal, it's political. A royal union means alliances, heirs, and legacies. Everyone has an opinion. Her council urges her to consider an English nobleman. Some whisper about Edward Courtenay, a charming if unremarkable courtier with Plantagenet blood. A marriage to Courtenay could calm public nerves and keep power close to home. Mary, however, has other ideas. From her earliest days, her heart has leaned towards Spain. Her mother was Spanish. Her education, her religion, even her sense of dignity, steeped in Habsburg pride. So when her cousin Charles V proposes a match with his son, Philip of Spain, Mary's eyes narrow in contemplation. Philip is young, 11 years her junior, but he is powerful. As heir to the vast Spanish Empire, a marriage to Philip would secure England's Catholic future and bind the country to one of Europe's mightiest dynasties. It is, on paper, a masterstroke. But the English people are not paper people. Word of the proposed match spreads like spilled wine across the countryside. Panic follows. English hearts, already wary of foreign entanglements, bristle at the thought of Spanish domination. Cartoons appear in alleyways depicting Mary chained to a Spanish groom. Ballads mock the union. Nobles whisper about a return to Roman tyranny. The Protestant minority, already on edge, interprets the match as confirmation of their worst fears, a Catholic stranglehold on the realm. Mary presses forward regardless. She trusts Philip, or at the very least she trusts what he represents. Her council protests, the public rages, but Mary digs in. In January 1554, rebellion erupts. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a nobleman from Kent, rallies a sizable force against the Spanish match. His goal is to unseat Mary and place Elizabeth, her Protestant half-sister, on the throne. Other nobles are drawn in, hesitantly like moths to a lamp with unclear wattage. The rebellion is fast, chaotic, and driven more by fear than strategy. Mary, confronted with open defiance, doesn't flinch. She rides into London, dresses plainly, and delivers a fiery speech at Guildhall. Her voice quivers only slightly as she declares her intention to defend both her crown and her people's liberty. "I am your queen," she says, "born of your blood, married to this land." The crowd cheers. The rebellion falters. Wyatt is captured. The rebels scatter. Heads roll. And now, Mary must decide what to do with her sister. Elizabeth had been kept at court under increasingly watchful eyes. Her letters are sifted, her servants questioned, her movements restricted. Did she support Wyatt? Historians still argue. Some believe she knew nothing. Others suspect clever silence. Either way, Mary has her arrested and sent to the Tower. Elizabeth's stay in the Tower is brief but terrifying. She's housed in the same apartments once occupied by Anne Boleyn, her mother, before her execution. Ravens circle overhead. Guards keep close watch. One night, Elizabeth scratches her name into the window glass, a trembling, desperate claim to life. Mary doesn't execute her. Whether it's sisterly love, political calculation, or divine hesitation, no one knows. But Elizabeth is eventually released and moved to house arrest under close supervision. It's a narrow escape. By midsummer, Mary weds Philip. The ceremony is formal, grand, and chillingly stiff. Philip wears Spanish finery. Mary glows with a nervous smile. He barely speaks English. She barely speaks Spanish. He stands beside her like a ghost in armour. The union is legal, but distant, more treaty than romance. In the following months, Philip travels often. Mary writes him letters filled with affection and longing. He replies with courtesy and obligation. Still, something astonishing happens. In 1555, Mary announces she is pregnant. The news sends ripples through Europe. Finally, an heir, a Catholic heir no less. Londoners light bonfires in celebration. Churches hold vigils. Mary retreats into confinement, her belly swelling, her dreams expanding like the empire she hopes to leave behind. Months pass. Preparations for the birth unfold. Cradles are carved. Midwives trained. But nothing happens. The due date comes and goes. Mary remains secluded, her body betraying her hope. No baby, no labour, no heartbeat. The child she felt kicking was likely a phantom pregnancy, an affliction not uncommon in women under extreme stress and longing. Mary emerges from her chambers, pale, thin and wordless. The people murmur. Philip departs again. The crown, so recently warmed by the promise of continuity, grows cold. Autumn cloaks the English countryside in damp gold as 1555 deepens. Fog weaves between half-timbered homes and the scent of wet leaves clings to cloaks and chimneys. But at court, there's a new scent. Smoke of a different kind, bitter and unmistakable. The first fires have been lit, and with them, Mary Tudor's reign begins to burn into legend. The phantom pregnancy has left her shaken. Though she never publicly confesses the heartbreak, her courtiers notice the way her fingers tighten around her rosary, how she gazes out the palace windows for long minutes without blinking. Her doctors murmur about stress, irregular humours, even divine testing. Philip, ever the political groom, makes a brief return to court before leaving again for his sprawling responsibilities abroad. He leaves no promises. Mary is alone once more, with her faith, her mission, and now, her fear. And in that fear, a terrible resolve begins to crystallise. She turns to the clergy, to the law, and to Parliament. The Heresy Acts, dormant legal relics from older Catholic England, are restored in full. Now, denying transubstantiation, refusing the sacraments, or preaching Protestantism isn't just frowned upon. It's treason, it's heresy, it's punishable by death, by fire no less. But the first flames don't flicker in London. They begin quietly in small towns, places like Canterbury and Gloucester, where local justices, encouraged by London, begin rounding up suspects. At first, the executions are cautious. A few notable Protestant preachers are targeted, then more, and soon the lists grow longer. On February 4th, 1555, John Rogers becomes the first martyr of Mary's Purge. A married father of 11 and a former Bible translator, Rogers is burned alive at Smithfield. Eyewitnesses say he walks to the stake as if going to his wedding. His children watch from the crowd. The smell of burning flesh lingers for days, and in that smoke, Mary earns the nickname that will shadow her for centuries, Bloody Mary. But is it fair? Here's where things twist. In raw numbers, Mary's persecutions, though horrifying, are not the largest in English history. Around 280 Protestants are executed during her 5-year reign. Her father, Henry VIII, killed over 50,000 people during his 38 years, including monks, rebels, and unlucky spouses. Her sister Elizabeth would later execute both Catholics and Protestants in a quieter, more bureaucratic fashion. Yet it is Mary who carries the crimson crown. Some of this reputation is earned. Mary does not merely approve of the executions, she defends them. In private counsel, she argues that burning heretics is a mercy, that saving their souls through pain is preferable to letting them perish in sin. She quotes scripture, she prays for them, and then she signs their death warrants. But much of the legend is shaped by a single book, Fox's Book of Martyrs. First published during Elizabeth's reign, this Protestant tome paints Mary in fire and brimstone. Its pages recount the deaths of men, women, and even children in vivid, agonising detail. These stories, printed and reprinted, form the backbone of Mary's bloody reputation. The Protestant martyrs become saints, and Mary becomes a monster. Back in her court, the atmosphere grows chillier by the week. Even those who once supported the Queen begin to squirm. Her advisers urge moderation. Some quietly suggest that the executions are backfiring, that the burnings stir sympathy for the victims and harden Protestant resolve. But Mary does not bend. To her, this is not vengeance. It is purification. The burnings continue. One case strikes a particular chord, the trial of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer, once the architect of England's Protestant Reformation and spiritual advisor to Henry VIII, is already imprisoned when Mary takes the throne. He is the man who annulled her mother's marriage and crowned Anne Boleyn. He is, in many ways, the architect of Mary's childhood ruin. At first, it seems he might escape. Under pressure, Cranmer recounts, publicly admitting his errors and re-embracing Catholic doctrine. But Mary orders his execution anyway. It is not enough to repent. He must also suffer. On March 21st, 1556, Cranmer is led to the stake in Oxford. In a dramatic reversal, he recants his recantation, declaring Protestantism true and condemning the Pope as Antichrist. As the flames rise, he holds his right hand, the one that signed his earlier confession, into the fire first, burning it deliberately as penance. Eyewitnesses say he dies without screaming. The story spreads like wildfire. The Marian persecutions reach their peak over the next year. Whole families are torn apart, pregnant women are burned, children are orphaned, and yet Mary, convinced she is saving souls, continues the campaign. Each new execution, however, brings diminishing returns. The people begin to turn, not against the heretics, but against the Queen. It is around this time that Mary begins to suffer from another bout of mysterious symptoms. Her belly swells again, her appetite changes. She grows tired, hopeful, prayerful. Word spreads. The Queen is pregnant again. Bells ring. Philip is summoned. And then, once more, nothing. Another phantom. Another hope snuffed. By now, even her most loyal supporters grow uneasy. Philip returns to England only briefly. He is colder this time, distracted by wars on the continent and ambitions elsewhere. Their marriage, once framed as a divine partnership, now resembles two orbiting planets, glimmering but distant. And Mary begins to fade. Her body, never robust, starts to betray her more visibly. The tremors worsen. Her skin loses colour. She has bouts of fever, dizziness, and pain. Doctors speculate everything from dropsy to uterine cancer. Still, she works. She signs documents with a shaking hand. She meets with ambassadors. She insists on attending Mass, even when too weak to kneel, and always she prays. Mary begins commissioning churches, hospitals, and educational foundations, acts of mercy, charity, and faith. She is not without compassion. She donates to the poor. She insists that priests be educated and humble, but it is the flames, not the arms, that dominate her story. A fringe anecdote emerges during this period, one whispered among servants and scribes. Mary, it is said, begins to suffer from nightmares. She dreams of smoke, of screaming, of children with charred hands. In one account, she wakes crying and demands the windows be opened, gasping, "I smell it still." Whether these stories are true or Protestant invention, no one can say, but they cling to her legacy like soot. By 1557, Mary's physical decline is undeniable. She loses weight, her hair thins, her voice weakens. Philip, now ruling Spain as king, does not return. He writes polite letters, he promises prayers, but he does not come. Mary's court shrinks with her. Her ladies whisper in smaller circles. The torchlight in her halls flickers, as if in mourning. Rumours spread that Elizabeth will soon take the crown. Some courtiers begin switching allegiance in subtle gestures. More bows, fewer Catholic symbols. Still, Mary will not name Elizabeth her heir. She mistrusts her sister, fears her Protestant sympathies, and clings to the belief that God may yet bless her with a miracle. And yet, on the streets of London, another reality takes root. Children play games called Burn the Heretic, reenacting the executions with sticks and ashes. Market sellers nickname their roast pig stands Smithfield Specials. Jokes, cruel and crude, bloom where prayers once were. It is as if the nation, unable to grieve publicly, turns to satire as a shield. And Mary? She remains. Every morning she dons the crimson of her office, she signs decrees, she prays over her people, and at night she returns to her private chapel, where the candles burn low and the shadows reach long. What history remembers most from these years is the flame, but what it too often forgets is the silence that followed, the mournful quiet of a queen who believed she was saving England's soul, and who could not understand why the people she loved hated her for it. The winds whipped colder in the waning days of 1557, carrying whispers of unrest and resignation through palace corridors and cathedral cloisters. Mary Tudor, once crowned with roaring cheers and glittering procession, now lingers in a state of shrinking influence and failing health. Her figure, once firm with resolve, has softened, stooped not just from physical pain, but from the weight of a nation seemingly slipping through her grasp. Philip of Spain has long since departed. his silver-clad ships fading over the horizon without promise of return. His absence echoes in Mary's court like a draught under a locked door. The marriage, forged in diplomatic fire and defended with stubborn loyalty, has grown cold. Letters come, still bearing the careful penmanship of royal protocol, but the intimacy, if it ever truly existed, has vanished. Philip's ambitions lie in continental wars and Iberian strongholds. England is a dimming candle on his political map, and Mary, clinging to the smouldering hope of a Catholic heir, begins to face what she has long refused to admit. Her body is failing. Each morning now begins with the help of 2 servants. Her steps are slow, her hands tremble. She suffers spells of faintness, stomach pain, and swelling in her legs. Her once bright eyes seem lost in constant calculation. Some blend of pain, prayer, and persistent grief. Physicians, those well-dressed peddlers of leeches and linctuses, offer no answers. Some whisper cancer. Others guess dropsy, or perhaps melancholy manifest in flesh. All agree on one thing. The Queen is dying. But even as her strength falters, Mary refuses to surrender the reins of her realm. She orders processions to pray for rain when the harvest fails. She demands daily updates from the battlefield when England, through its alliance with Spain, is dragged into a war with France. Against her better judgment, and with growing pressure from Philip, she allows English troops to support his continental ambitions. The result is disastrous. In early 1558, news arrives that Calais has fallen. Calais, the last English possession in France held since the days of Henry V, is lost to the French crown in a swift and humiliating defeat. For a nation that still romanticizes its medieval conquests, this is a wound to national pride. For Mary, it is personal. She receives the news in silence, turns her face to the fire, and murmurs, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Historians still argue whether she truly said it, but the quote, like much in her reign, has stuck. Calais becomes the final emblem of her misfortunes, a tangible, geographic echo of her broader failure to hold on to the old world she so desperately tried to restore. But not all around her are mourning. In great houses and humble chapels a quiet shift begins. Protestant exiles who fled to the continent during her reign have begun returning. Some settle in London, cloaked in discretion. Others move with a missionary's zeal, spreading pamphlets and whispered sermons. The fires of Smithfield have created martyrs, yes, but they've also created a cause. Protestantism, far from being stamped out, has become galvanised, wrapped in the flames of resistance and memory. And in the wings waits Elizabeth. Mary's half-sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, has remained technically under surveillance since the Wyatt Rebellion. But the political tide has shifted. Many nobles, anxious about the lack of an heir, begin pinning their hopes on Elizabeth. She is sharp, politically cautious, and, most importantly, Protestant. Courtiers who once wore rosaries now wear quiet smiles in Elizabeth's presence. Mary, of course, sees the danger. Though she is never formally named Elizabeth as her successor, the writing glows on every gilded wall. Foreign ambassadors nudge for confirmation. Her council grows nervous. And Mary, she hesitates. She does not trust Elizabeth, not because of some petty rivalry, but because she knows exactly what her sister represents, the unravelling of everything Mary has tried to restore. To Mary, Elizabeth is not simply a threat to her throne, but to her soul's mission. Allowing her to rule would be to admit that the Reformation cannot be reversed, that the sacrifices of martyrs and monarchs alike were in vain. Still, the law is clear. The Act of Succession passed by Henry VIII places Elizabeth firmly in line, and Mary, for all her convictions, is not ready to break the law in her final days. Meanwhile, the court becomes a gallery of whispered anticipation. Nobles watch Mary's declining health with the quiet patience of vultures. Some begin planning celebrations, others hedge bets on the length of Elizabeth's reign before some unseen catastrophe disrupts the fragile order again. And yet, amid this circling of the future, Mary remains very much alive. Worn, yes, but not entirely extinguished. In a final act of sovereign stubbornness, she redoubles her commitment to religious reform. More monasteries are re-endowed, more clerical schools are funded. She writes impassioned letters to Rome, urging stronger ties. She orders the printing of catechisms. Her vision is still clear, and England returned to the fold of Catholic Christendom. But the people, increasingly, are tired. The economy has faltered under war and famine. Coinage remains debased, wages stagnant. Protestants live in fear. Catholics grow uneasy about the burnings. Even her acts of charity, of which there are many, cannot erase the lingering scent of scorched flesh that clings to her reign. One fringe detail, often overlooked in the grand histories, tells of Mary ordering the planting of herbs and flowers around chapels and hospitals. A symbolic gesture to counter the stench of the executions. Lavender, rosemary and thyme, scents of memory and mourning. Whether true or not, it feels fitting. As 1558 wanes, the Queen's health takes a final turn. She withdraws from public life almost entirely, seen only by her closest ladies and most trusted chaplains. Her face, once stern and determined, now seems etched with regret. She is, at last, a queen without illusion. On November the 17th, 1558, in the early hours of morning, Mary Tudor dies in her bed at St. James's Palace. Those present describe her passing as quiet. No last words of grandeur, no curses, no dramatic confessions. Just a final breath, and then stillness. News spreads quickly. The court, half prepared, makes its shift. Elizabeth is proclaimed queen by mid-morning. Bells toll, but few mourn. The transition is swift, seamless, and curiously muted. No uprisings, no resistance. Just the end of a reign, and the birth of another. Mary's body is buried at Westminster Abbey in the Lady Chapel built by Henry VII. Years later, Elizabeth will be buried in the same tomb, above her sister, beneath a shared slab bearing the inscription, "Partners in throne and grave," a gesture of unity, or irony, depending on whom you ask. And so the woman who fought for faith, for legitimacy and for love, is laid to rest in silence. The bells toll one last time. The fires are doused. The smoke rises and vanishes into the cold November sky. Mary is gone. But her legacy, her legacy, has only just begun to ignite. The dawn that follows Mary Tudor's death is for many in England eerily quiet. No riots shake the streets. No armies mobilise in her defence. Instead, a hush settles over the land. Part mourning, part anticipation. For all the drama of her reign, her exit is almost gentle. As if the nation, long burdened by fire and fear, lets out a long, reluctant exhale. But even as her body cools, her memory begins to harden, and like hot iron plunged into water, it cracks into sharp and lasting shapes. Across Europe, foreign ambassadors send their dispatches. In Spain, Philip receives the news with solemn brevity. He writes a letter of condolence. He orders a requiem mass. But there is no indication of personal grief. To him, Mary's death is not the loss of a beloved wife. It is the end of a political chapter. A door quietly closing, another quietly opening. In England, Elizabeth ascends with calculated grace. She enters London draped in golden damask, flanked by nobles who had once sworn loyalty to her sister. Her smile is careful, her words even more so. She promises religious tolerance, political stability, and a return to prosperity. The people, weary of executions and uncertainty, flock to her cause like moths to a lantern. In her first speech she subtly reclaims the national identity. Protestant, proud, forward-looking, and so begins the great project of forgetting. The Marian burnings, once justified by official doctrine, become an embarrassment. The bonfires of Smithfield are spoken of in hushed tones, then not at all. Protestant writers begin crafting a new narrative. Chief among them, John Foxe. Foxe's Book of Martyrs, first published in 1563, becomes the cornerstone of Mary's bloody legend. It is a thick tome, packed with ghastly illustrations and vivid accounts of suffering. We read of flames licking at pious faces, of women cradling infants as they burn, of old men weeping hymns while bound to the stake. Whether all the details are true is almost beside the point. The emotion is true. The fear, the anger, it resonates. Foxe paints Mary as a fanatic, a tyrant cloaked in velvet, ordering the destruction of England's soul. In his pages, she's not just a queen, she's a cautionary tale, and this version of Mary sticks. For centuries, schoolchildren are taught her reign as a dark interlude between two golden ages. Henry, the flawed but mighty patriarch. Elizabeth, the radiant virgin queen. And between them, Mary, the shadow, the mistake, the blood-soaked interregnum best skimmed over quickly in history class, But as with all villains of history, the real woman was far more complex. Peel back the smoke and the scorn, and we see a queen who never expected to rule. A woman whose childhood was shaped by betrayal, whose adolescence was defined by isolation, and whose adulthood was a struggle for legitimacy. Mary did not inherit a stable throne. She clawed her way to it through intrigue, rebellion, and doubt. She was deeply intelligent, well-educated, and politically shrewd. She understood diplomacy. She maintained correspondence in multiple languages, and she believed perhaps more than anything else in duty. Her religion was not a tool, it was her compass. To Mary, Catholicism wasn't just tradition, it was truth. Eternal, sacred, unquestionable. She didn't burn heretics out of cruelty, but out of conviction. She genuinely believed she was saving her people from eternal damnation. It was misguided, yes. It was horrifying, but it was not heartless. In fact, many who knew Mary personally described her as kind. She was generous with alms. She comforted the sick. She mourned sincerely for lost friends. But the machinery of monarchy does not care for softness, and her reign demanded harder edges. And then there was the loneliness. Few monarchs in history have ruled with such isolation. Her council was divided. Her husband was distant. Her people were suspicious. And her body, her own traitorous flesh, failed her at every turn. The phantom pregnancies weren't just political disappointments, they were personal devastations. Each false swelling was a shattered hope, a reminder that her bloodline would end with her. That isolation only deepened as Elizabeth's star began to rise. Mary had once doted on her younger sister, even intervening in court to protect her. But as their religious and political differences grew, so did the gulf between them. Mary could never fully trust Elizabeth, too clever, too charming, too Protestant. And yet, in the end, she had no choice but to let her ascend. And Elizabeth knew this. Once queen, Elizabeth wastes little time rebranding the monarchy. The burnings are stopped. The Latin Mass is replaced by English prayers. The vestments are simplified. The church is nationalised, polished and repackaged. Mary's statues are quietly removed. Her portraits, once displayed with irreverence, are pushed into back corridors. But even Elizabeth can't fully erase her. Whispers remain. Old women light candles for Mary on the anniversaries of her death. Catholic households speak of her with quiet reverence. In pockets of rural England, her reign is remembered not as a terror, but as a time of sacred return. And on the continent, Mary is seen as a martyr, one of the few monarchs who dared to defy the Protestant tide. Over the centuries, scholars begin to re-examine her. In the 19th century, as historians dig deeper into primary sources, a more nuanced portrait emerges. They find letters, speeches, treaties, all revealing a woman of depth and complexity. They uncover her intelligence, her sense of humour, even her stubborn hope. One French ambassador described her as more feared than loved, but never without dignity. That dignity, though overlooked, remained constant. Even when her crown wobbled, even when the fires rose, even when her own people jeered, she never lost the quiet certainty that she was right. Whether that certainty was admirable or dangerous remains as ever up for debate. Historians still argue whether her persecutions were unprecedented or simply the norm of the time. They debate her effectiveness as a ruler. Did she really fail, or was she simply undone by impossible circumstances? Some even wonder, if Mary had lived longer, produced an heir, or kept Philip by her side, might England have remained Catholic? Might the course of Western history have shifted entirely? We'll never know. But in those questions lies the real legacy of Mary Tudor. Not as a caricature drawn in fire and fear, not as a woman with a drink named after her, but as a ruler who tried, with fierce conviction, to right the wrongs of her past, who believed in something bigger than herself, who fought for a faith she thought eternal, even when it made her despised. And that, perhaps, is what makes her story so haunting. Because while other monarchs left behind monuments and golden ages, Mary left behind a silence filled with prayers and ashes, a silence that forces us to ask, how do we remember those who failed not by cruelty, but by conviction? Spring tiptoes into England as Elizabeth thus begins her reign, but the soil is still warm from the fires of her sister's convictions. Mary is barely in the ground when the process of political sanitization begins, and with it, a slow and deliberate unwriting of her brief turbulent legacy. But before the new court fully asserts its glittering Protestant identity, Elizabeth must first address the most immediate concern, the state of the realm Mary left behind. It is not in ruins, but it is badly frayed. The treasury groans under the weight of costly wars and court expenses. The coinage, still debased from Mary's reign, glints like fool's gold in every purse. Morale is low, the economy is sluggish, and religious tension still simmers just beneath the surface. The country is not burning anymore, but the smoke has hardly cleared, and so, with her usual performative ease, Elizabeth steps into the role of a saviour. The stage is set. A young Protestant queen, dazzling in white, smiling through Latin-laced gritted teeth, reassuring the nobles, calming the merchants, and appealing directly to the people's collective desire to move on. But to move forward, England first must exorcise the ghost of Mary. And Mary, contrary to expectation, lingers stubbornly. Her most dedicated supporters, loyal Catholics in Yorkshire, Norfolk, and pockets of Wales, mourn her deeply. Some refer to her only as the true Queen. Priests continue to hold underground masses in her memory. Secret altars bloom in shadowed corners, bearing her likeness alongside those of saints and martyrs. Mary becomes a symbol, not just of resistance to Protestant reform, but of a romanticised, suffering nobility. And yet, the Protestant majority, emboldened by Elizabeth's careful reforms, begins reshaping Mary's image from within the court outward. They don't just want to remember her as misguided, they want her to be monstrous. And so the pamphlets begin. Cheaply printed and widely distributed, these works cast Mary as a tyrant whose rule threatened not only England's faith but its very soul. The term Bloody Mary, once whispered, now roars from broadsheets and pulpits. Cartoons show her with a torch in one hand and a noose in the other. Ballads mock her phantom pregnancies, portraying her as a woman so obsessed with motherhood that her own body turned against her. Even in death, Mary is not granted dignity. Historians will later point out that such depictions often say more about the era that created them than the woman they describe. The Elizabethan age needs a villain, and Mary, Catholic, childless, unpopular, makes for the perfect shadow against which Elizabeth can shine. But if we turn down the volume on the propaganda and step away from the pamphlets, we find a curious thing. Not everyone hated her. In Spain and Italy, Catholic scholars refer to her as Mary the Pious. In Rome, her efforts to restore papal supremacy are praised. Even some English Catholics who suffered under Elizabeth's later persecutions look back at Mary's reign with something like longing. Not because it was easy, but because it was clear. Mary's England was a place where faith had weight, where religious identity was worn like armour, not hidden like contraband. To some, that certainty, however painful, was preferable to the ambiguity of Elizabeth's balancing act. One of the more unusual accounts comes from a Portuguese merchant, who wrote in his diary during a visit to London in 1561. He recalls seeing a group of older women in an alley near St. Paul's, huddled in prayer around a crude portrait of Mary. They passed around a single candle, shielding it from the wind with calloused hands, whispering Latin prayers that had once echoed in every church. When approached, they scattered like birds. That scene, barely a footnote in history, captures something essential. Mary may have failed as a monarch by most conventional standards. No heir, no peace, no legacy of prosperity. But she left behind a heartbeat, a pulse just strong enough to remind the world that belief, once ignited, does not die easily. But let's not fall entirely into sentiment. There is no denying the fear and pain her reign brought. No rewriting can undo the scorch marks left behind by her burnings. The executions, public, brutal, deliberate, became part of the national psyche, and Mary's refusal to temper her convictions, even as they alienated her people, made her a tragic figure of near Shakespearean dimensions. She loved England, that much is clear. She genuinely believed she was saving its soul, and in the most excruciating twist of all, it was that very love that doomed her legacy. Had she been less devout, less stubborn, more politically pragmatic, she might have found a middle path. But Mary was not a politician. She was a believer, and believers, history reminds us, often make the most complicated rulers. After her death, England's transformation is rapid. The Latin Mass is outlawed, the Book of Common Prayer returns, The Pope's authority is once again denied. Priests who refuse to comply are removed. Many go into hiding, some flee abroad. Others, stubborn in their own convictions, stay and face imprisonment or execution. Elizabeth, ever careful with appearances, does not launch her own wave of fire and sword. Her persecutions are quieter, more legalistic, but they are no less real. Dozens of Catholics are hanged or imprisoned under her rule. But history remembers these not as atrocities, but as necessary measures. The fire that consumed Mary's victims left visible scars. Elizabeth's punishments were easier to conceal. In time, Mary's image becomes a literary trope. Shakespeare notably never directly names her, but the spectre of a mad, barren queen appears in echoes. Lady Macbeth's "Unsex me here," the betrayed Gertrude, even the proud and tragic Cleopatra. Whether deliberate or coincidental, the themes resonate. Over the next centuries, Mary appears in paintings as a heavy-jowled, severe woman draped in crimson and black. The colour red clings to her like a curse, as if history can't imagine her in anything else. In novels and films, she becomes a stock villain. Pale, cruel, bitter. Rarely does she laugh. Rarely is she portrayed as young, despite ascending the throne at 37. Her phantom pregnancies are played for tragedy or mockery, never for sympathy. Her burnings are emphasised. Her charity is not. But in recent years, historians have begun to peel back the caricature. Revisionist biographies explore her early education, her nuanced diplomacy, her surprisingly modern approach to welfare and public health. They examine the trauma of her childhood, her fierce devotion to her mother, and her ability to survive court politics for over 2 decades before her reign. Some even suggest that had she ruled in a different era, without the shadow of the Reformation, without the weight of dynastic instability, she might have been remembered as a capable, even compassionate monarch. That's the thing about Mary. She doesn't fit neatly into any category. She's not just a tyrant, not just a victim, not just a queen. She's all of them. And perhaps that's why her story lingers. Not because we enjoy hating her, but because deep down we recognise the fragility of her hope. We see ourselves in her contradictions, in her faith, her fear, her fury. She remains a riddle that refuses to be simplified. A woman whose reign burned brightly and briefly, and whose smoke still drifts through the pages of history. The shadow of Mary Tudor lengthens even as England forgets her. In the decades following her death, her memory is reshaped again and again, bent, stretched, and polished to suit the shifting needs of monarchs, ministers, and moralists. And the irony of it all is that for a woman so vilified, so bound to her flame-stoked legacy, Mary herself left behind little in the way of personal reflection. No memoirs, no dramatic last speeches, no deathbed letters to posterity. Her silence, perhaps, became the canvas on which others painted her most vividly. But let's step back for a moment from the pamphlets, the propaganda, the political theatre, and look instead at the human being who walked the winding halls of Hampton Court and Whitehall. Imagine her alone at her writing desk, scratching out a letter to Philip in a hand grown shaky with fatigue. Picture her kneeling in her private chapel, candlelight casting flickering shadows across her worn features, lips whispering a prayer she's recited since childhood. This, too, was Mary. In those quiet, candlelit hours, she was not Bloody Mary. She was a woman deeply entangled in love, power, and fear. And that entanglement had its roots long before her reign began. For all her adult life, Mary had known what it meant to lose everything. She lost her mother to exile and slow death. She lost her title, her inheritance, her household. Her very identity as a princess was revoked, replaced with the humiliating status of a royal bastard. Most heartbreakingly, she lost her sense of safety in a world that, by all accounts, had once adored her. It's important to understand that Mary's reign didn't emerge from a blank slate. It was a reaction, raw, urgent and deeply personal, to years of displacement and grief. Her policies weren't born solely from political strategy, but from an aching desire to restore a world she believed had been unjustly torn from her. Catholicism wasn't just faith. It was the last living thread connecting her to her mother, to her childhood, and to a version of England that no longer existed. That's why the burnings, as horrifying as they were, make more sense when viewed through that lens. They weren't expressions of bloodlust, but of desperation. Mary wasn't trying to build a new empire. She was trying to resurrect the one she had lost, and it didn't work. The burnings produced martyrs instead of conversions. Her marriage to Philip secured an alliance, but not affection. The restoration of the Catholic Church lacked both longevity and local buy-in. Her attempts at financial reform were cut short by war and inflation. Her health gave out before any true legacy could be cemented. But here's where it gets thorny, because her reign wasn't entirely a failure. Though the flames dominate our memory, Mary also brought about important reforms. She attempted to stabilise the currency, undertaking a plan for recoinage that Elizabeth would later complete. She advocated for the poor, founded charities, and began to restore lands to the church that had been stripped during her father's reign. Her court was less lavish but more pious, and she made education a central concern, especially among the clergy. It just wasn't enough. She lacked time, she lacked heirs, and most tragically, she lacked the political support needed to make her vision sustainable. What she didn't lack was courage. Time and again, Mary proved herself willing to defy expectations. She rallied forces to claim her throne against impossible odds. She walked into Guildhall during Wyatt's rebellion not knowing whether the crowd might tear her down or lift her up. She made choices, unpopular ones, dangerous ones, and stood by them, fully aware of the consequences. There's a strange kind of nobility in that. Not always the effective sort. Certainly not the glamorous sort, but real nonetheless. And still, the myth persisted. By the 17th century, Mary's image had become a convenient symbol of religious intolerance. Protestants viewed her as a warning. Allow Catholicism to return, and the stakes will return too. Even in literature she was cast as a Gothic figure, gloomy, rigid, and vengeful. When England later tangled with Catholic Spain, Mary's legacy became part of the ideological armoury, proof that popery led to tyranny. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as British nationalism swelled and the Church of England solidified its place, her image grew darker still. Victorian historians, with their love of moral judgment, saw Mary as the ultimate example of femininity gone wrong, overly emotional, tragically childless, and fatally pious. She became a template for what a woman in power ought not to be. By contrast, Elizabeth's legend soared. Where Mary had been solemn, Elizabeth was witty. Where Mary was rigid, Elizabeth was adaptable. Where Mary burned her enemies, Elizabeth charmed them, before quietly imprisoning or executing them when necessary. And so history, ever fond of neat binaries, elevated Elizabeth as the bright dawn to Mary's long dark night. Yet not all accounts were so unforgiving. Some Catholic writers, especially on the continent, continued to defend Mary's reign well into the modern era. They praised her theological commitment, her bravery, her integrity. They argued that she was a victim of cruel circumstance, not a cruel ruler. Even today, Mary has defenders in academic circles who see her not as a villain, but as a tragic reformer, undone by the very world she tried to heal. Still, these attempts at revision haven't reached the popular imagination. To most, she remains the queen with blood on her hands and emptiness in her womb. And maybe that's because we're drawn to simple stories, ones with clear heroes and villains. Mary complicates that. Her actions demand reckoning. Her motives demand empathy. Her failures demand context. She's the kind of figure who resists summary. And maybe that's why she still fascinates. Today, in Westminster Abbey, tourists pass her tomb without always realising it. The plaque above reads simply, Mary and Elizabeth Sisters in Hope of Resurrection. That's it. No mention of her title, no defence of her reign, no fiery epitaph. Just a shared grave with a sister who succeeded, and arguably eclipsed, her. Some say it was Elizabeth's idea to be buried with Mary. Whether out of guilt, magnanimity, or irony, no one knows. But in that quiet corner of the abbey, beneath centuries of dust and choral echoes, the two sisters lie stacked, an uneasy truce forged in stone. Perhaps they've made peace, these daughters of Henry VIII, so different in life, so inseparable in death. Perhaps their spirits whisper across the marble, sharing regrets, jokes, or simply a weary silence. Or perhaps they still argue, over religion, over legacy, over who loved their father more. No one knows, but we do know this. Mary Tudor reigned in a world not built for her. She ruled with passion, conviction, and at times terrifying certainty. She left behind no heirs, no lasting church, no golden age of poetry or exploration. Only questions. And perhaps that is her final gift. An invitation not to judge, but to wonder. It begins as a whisper, almost too soft to hear. Cloaked figures moving quietly at dusk, messages delivered in hushed voices, and foreign languages muttered in candlelit chapels. The Spanish match, once hailed by Mary as the spiritual cornerstone of her reign, has started to fester beneath the surface of her kingdom like a wound improperly dressed. And just as the fire from her religious reform sparked martyrdom, the politics of her marriage stoke rebellion. When Mary announced her intention to marry Philip of Spain, her Privy Council blinked in stunned silence. The ink was barely dry on her coronation proclamations, and already she was tying the future of England to the sprawling Habsburg Empire. Philip, the son of Emperor Charles V and heir to the Spanish throne, brought with him the full weight of Catholic Europe, and all the baggage that entailed. On parchment, the union looked ideal. A strong Catholic alliance, access to Spanish trade, military support, a potential heir conceived under divine grace. To Mary, raised on Spanish culture and moulded by her mother's staunch allegiance to Rome, it was as natural as kneeling in a pew, but for England, it felt like betrayal. The memory of Spanish troops in European wars, the tales of inquisitional cruelty whispered by travelling merchants, and the ever-present fear of foreign control turned public sentiment sour fast. No amount of royal propaganda could stifle the suspicion that England might become a satellite in the Spanish orbit, ruled not from London, but from Madrid. And Philip didn't help matters. He arrived in 1554 with a stiff smile and an even stiffer presence, formal, awkward, and uncharismatic. He spoke no English. He brought Spanish advisers who viewed English courtiers with barely concealed disdain. He travelled with a strict Catholic entourage, and he often left Mary's side to discuss continental affairs that had little to do with England. Though polite in public, he was distant in private, spending as little time with Mary as duty allowed. Still, the Queen was captivated. She had waited her entire life for a partner. Philip, cold and distant as he was, offered not just companionship but purpose. With him, she could imagine an heir. With him, she could believe that her life had not been a prolonged exercise in suffering. Her letters to him were tender, sometimes even pleading, overflowing with warmth that was rarely returned. It's painful to read them now, the subtle heartbreak beneath each carefully inked word. And while Mary dreamt of unity, England plotted rebellion. The Wyatt Rebellion of 1554 was not merely a spontaneous outburst. It was the culmination of years of unease. Led by Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, the uprising sought to prevent the Spanish marriage at all costs. Wyatt, a Protestant and an English patriot, feared that Philip's arrival would mark the beginning of England's slow absorption into Spain's Catholic sphere. Wyatt's forces gathered in Kent, a region known for its Protestant sympathies and independent streak. At first, the rebellion was small, but as word spread of foreign grooms and foreign gods, support trickled in. The plan was bold: march on London, depose Mary, and place Elizabeth on the throne. Yes, Elizabeth, the younger sister, the Protestant hope, the living legacy of Anne Boleyn. And though Elizabeth likely had no direct hand in the rebellion, her name was a rallying cry. Mary, for her part, remained unshaken. In one of the defining moments of her reign, she appeared at London's Guildhall to address the citizens directly. Dressed simply but regally, she delivered a speech that crackled with conviction. "I am your queen," she declared. "I was born in this realm. I will never marry out of it but by the advice and consent of my council and the estates." Her voice, normally quiet, cut through the air like a blade. The city rallied to her side. Wyatt's forces, disorganised and poorly supplied, faltered as they neared the city. They were met with armed resistance and, lacking widespread support, quickly collapsed. Wyatt himself was captured, paraded through London, and later executed. His head was placed on a pike as a warning to any who would question the Spanish match again. But the damage was done. In the rebellion's wake, suspicion curled like smoke around Elizabeth. Mary had her arrested and sent to the Tower. It was the same tower where their mother Anne had awaited execution. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Elizabeth maintained her innocence, offering careful answers and wide-eyed insistence that she had no knowledge of the plot. and there was no proof to the contrary. Mary hesitated. She could have had Elizabeth executed. Many on her council urged her to do so. It would eliminate the Protestant threat, secure her succession, purify her court. But Mary could not do it. Perhaps she remembered their shared childhood, the quiet games, the way they clutched each other's hands during their father's angriest tirades. Or perhaps she feared that executing her sister would cast a shadow even she could not escape. Either way, Elizabeth was spared, but she would not be trusted again. As for Philip, he remained in England just long enough to see the rebellion quelled, and Mary declared victorious. Then he left, back to Spain, to war, to politics. Mary's letters grew increasingly sorrowful. She begged him to return. She hinted at pregnancy. She prayed. And for a moment it seemed those prayers might be answered. By autumn, Mary's abdomen began to swell. Her appetite changed. She stopped menstruating. The court erupted in cautious celebration. A child? Finally! The heir to cement the Catholic future of England. Rooms were prepared, midwives summoned, a nursery readied, and then silence. Months passed. No labour, no child. Only Mary, growing weaker, her belly now soft and shapeless. Physicians were puzzled. Courtiers whispered. Some dared to suggest she had never been pregnant at all. Others murmured darker things, that it was a punishment, a sign, a divine warning. The truth was simpler and sadder. Most modern historians believe Mary suffered from a phantom pregnancy, possibly brought on by a combination of stress, hormonal imbalances, and overwhelming psychological desire. Her body mirrored her desperation. After weeks of delay, the court finally accepted the truth. There would be no heir. Mary, heartbroken and humiliated, withdrew from public life. Her marriage, once hopeful, became a diplomatic obligation. Philip returned briefly, but his affection, never strong, had withered completely. The Queen had lost not only her child, but her dream, and the people noticed. Mary's popularity, already fragile, declined sharply. The burnings had begun, the religious changes accelerated, but now they were paired with disappointment and fear. She was no longer just the Catholic Queen. She was the barren Queen, the one who had risked it all for a marriage that brought no joy, no child, and no peace. Yet she didn't stop. Mary doubled down on her faith, on her reforms, on her punishments. The flames continued to rise in Smithfield and beyond, and now, behind each execution, there was not just theology, but personal grief. The Spanish match had promised her everything: legitimacy, love, and a future. It had delivered a kingdom on edge and a heart unfulfilled. And still, Mary prayed. The year is 1554. The smell of damp earth and burning tallow hangs over London, and beneath the spires and thatched roofs, a rebellion has just been crushed, but the embers still glow. Mary Tudor stands victorious, though not unscathed. The Wyatt rebellion is over. Its leader is dead. Elizabeth is under house arrest. Philip, her distant husband, has departed, and England teeters uneasily between awe and anxiety. Mary believes she has done what God required. She interprets the rebellion as a test of faith, a divine fire through which her legitimacy and her mission have been purified. And yet, though she wears the crown more firmly now, the ground beneath it is less stable than ever. The aftermath of the rebellion transforms her court. It becomes more insular, more suspicious. Advisers tread carefully, eyes ever watchful for signs of dissent. Surveillance increases. The machinery of state begins to grind more tightly around potential threats. And Mary, once hopeful that her rule might be defined by healing, finds herself drawn deeper into the grim arithmetic of consequence. Her next move is not diplomatic or domestic, it is visceral, it is fire. In early 1555, her government begins executing Protestants under the revived Heresy Acts. The first few deaths are seen as exemplary warnings, meant to inspire obedience and show the seriousness of the Queen's return to Catholic orthodoxy. But the burnings don't end, they accelerate. Soon, execution becomes ritual. The condemned are paraded through cobbled streets, often barefoot, flanked by guards, to the public square. There, in front of crowds hungry for drama, or just desperate for something to break the bleak routine, they are tied to stakes. Wood is piled, torches are lit, prayers are shouted, then drowned by screams. Smithfield, the open market square in London, becomes the most infamous theatre of death. But the burnings are not confined to the capital. Oxford, Canterbury, Gloucester, Lewes. These cities too see smoke curling into their skies. The list of victims grows. Men and women, young and old, known figures and nameless parishioners. Some recant under pressure, only to be burned anyway. Others go singing into the fire, defiant to the end. The more they resist, the more their stories spread. Mary watches this unfold from the palaces of Whitehall and Hampton Court. Reports reach her in carefully worded letters. She reads them, she prays over them, and she signs the warrants. It is here that her story hardens into legend. Because while the Marian persecutions do not reach the numbers of other historical atrocities, their theatricality and public nature sear them into memory. The flames do more than kill, they imprint. In markets and churches and homes, people whisper names like Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley and Thomas Cranmer. These are not just men anymore, they are symbols, and as the flames rise, so does the mythology. Protestant exiles, many of whom fled to the continent during Mary's reign, begin to publish their accounts. In cities like Geneva and Frankfurt, presses run day and night, printing pamphlets that recount each burning with lurid detail. Stories of charred bones, shrieking prayers, and blood-soaked straw circulate like wildfire. They exaggerate, of course, they dramatise, but they're effective. By the time Fox's Book of Martyrs hits shelves during Elizabeth's reign, the narrative is locked in. Mary is Bloody Mary, the wicked queen who turned England into a furnace. And here's where the tragedy deepens. Mary believes, truly, unshakably, that she is saving her people, that by burning heretics she is sparing their souls. To her this is not cruelty, it is mercy. Misguided, yes. Destructive, absolutely. But never flippant. Each execution weighs on her. Some nights she's said to retreat in tears after reading reports. She fasts, she prays harder. She believes that if she can purge her realm of heresy, God will reward her with peace, with stability, with a child. But God is silent, and Philip is absent, and the people are restless. In the second half of 1555, something subtle begins to shift. The public, once too frightened to protest, grows weary. Sympathy for the martyrs increases. Priests tasked with overseeing executions are sometimes heckled. Jokes begin to circulate. Dark humour about barbecues for the blessed. Children mock the burnings in alley games. Even among the devout, unease bubbles. Is this what the gospel looks like? Some begin to ask. Yet the Queen remains steadfast. By the end of that year, she's no longer waiting for political victory. She's waiting for a miracle. Mary becomes convinced she's pregnant again. This time, there is no announcement, no formal celebration. The signs are vague, swelling, nausea, missed cycles. But after the humiliation of her first false pregnancy, the court treads carefully. Only a handful of advisers are informed. Preparations are made quietly, and still no child comes. The symptoms subside. Her body deflates. Her hope fractures. It is here, in this slow erosion of body and belief, that Mary begins to physically collapse. The headaches become constant. She suffers from insomnia, bleeding gums, trembling hands. Her appetite vanishes. Her colour fades. She loses weight rapidly, and her voice, once soft but clear, becomes a rasp. Physicians offer little help. Some whisper cancer. Others suggest dropsy, or an infection of the womb. Still others dare not say anything at all. And always, around her, the fires continue. One particularly grim episode occurs in Lewes, a small town on the southern coast. 17 Protestants are burned in a single public display. Entire families are gathered and tied to stakes. Eyewitnesses report that the heat was so intense it cracked the surrounding windows. The crowd, usually passive, erupted in anger afterward. Stones were thrown, guards were injured. It's one of the first signs that the mood is truly shifting. Mary is informed but takes no action to stop future executions. To her, the burnings are not the problem. They are the solution. Yet even within her own council, doubts are rising. Some of her closest advisers, including Lord Paget and Stephen Gardiner, begin urging restraint. Not because they disagree with her faith, but because they sense the political cost is too high. But Mary, isolated and suffering, cannot back down. To admit error now would be to admit that the dead were killed in vain. And so she pushes forward, even as her hands tremble, even as her husband writes fewer letters, even as her own people turn from her. In the winter of 1556, snow blankets London. The burnings continue, the smoke spirals into grey skies, and inside her private chapel Mary kneels alone, surrounded by flickering candles and the scent of cold stone. She prays for strength, for salvation, for a child, for a legacy not built on fire. But history has already started writing its version, and it will not be kind. By 1556, the smoke from the burnings no longer shocks the people of England. It lingers like a permanent haze in the national memory. The scent of scorched flesh and wet ash becomes an unwelcome feature of daily life, particularly in London, where the bodies pile up and the crowds become both numb and fascinated. What once felt like justice, or at least religious necessity, now carries the aftertaste of dread. And yet, the fires keep rising. Mary Tudor, diminished in health but not in conviction, continues to sign warrants with trembling hands. Some say she prays over each name. Others claim she signs without reading. The truth lies, as always, somewhere between reverence and bureaucracy. What is clear is that by now, even the most devout among her supporters are growing tired, not of Catholicism necessarily, but of the smoke. A kind of national fatigue settles in. People stop talking openly. Protestant sermons disappear underground again, this time with added caution and better code words. Secret house churches grow bolder and more coordinated, protected by an expanding network of sympathetic families, sympathetic priests and sympathetic noblemen. The Inquisition-style tactics employed by local officials begin to falter. You can't arrest an entire village after all, not without making martyrs. Still, Mary holds to the path she's carved. The heresy acts remain enforced, and the burnings, though increasingly controversial, remain unchallenged by her core advisors. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or sheer inertia, few dare confront the Queen head-on. But even as her court quietly fragments, her body begins to betray her completely. Mary's physical decline accelerates. Her legs swell, most likely from dropsy. Her stomach bulges again, though not with child. Her eyesight weakens, and she often needs help navigating corridors she once knew by heart. At public events, she appears for only brief moments, wrapped in heavy gowns despite the warming seasons, her face pale and expressionless. She no longer rides, she no longer walks far. She rules from a chair more often than from a throne. Ambassadors, once eager to report her every word, begin focusing on Elizabeth instead. The Queen's younger sister, ever the careful observer, remains technically under house arrest but enjoys increasing freedoms. Her letters are still intercepted, her visitors still monitored. But she is no longer seen as the seditious threat she once was. The longer Mary reigns without an heir, the more inevitable Elizabeth becomes, and Mary knows it. This is the cruelest truth of her later reign. She lives long enough to see the arc of her dreams bending toward failure. Her marriage to Philip, the bedrock of her foreign policy, has failed to produce love, loyalty, or children. Her religious reforms, once swift and dramatic, are now largely resisted and feared. Her economic plans, especially her attempts to reform the coinage and stabilise the treasury, are only partially completed. Worst of all, the people do not love her. She's no tyrant in the mould of her father, no golden icon like Elizabeth will become. She is above all a woman monarch in a man's world, grappling not only with religious upheaval, but with the limits of power in a nation that has never before been ruled by a woman with absolute authority. And yet, for all the cruelty attributed to her, Mary's reign was not without mercy. She pardoned rebels. She funded charities. She personally oversaw improvements to hospitals and religious institutions. She ensured the poor received alms during harvest failures. She refused to enrich herself at the Crown's expense. In a different time, these acts might have elevated her reputation, but they are overshadowed, utterly irrevocably, by the executions. Take, for instance, the story of Agnes Prest. A Cornish woman and staunch Protestant, she was burned in Exeter in 1557. Her trial, brief and brutal, made her a martyr almost instantly. Or William Flower, who disrupted Easter Mass in Westminster Abbey and was dismembered before being burned alive, his limbs hacked off as warning to any who might defile the holy sacraments. These executions were not anomalies, they were policy, and policy, as history teaches us, is memory's favourite villain. Yet even amid the terror, there are moments of odd tenderness. In private, Mary continues to show affection to those closest to her. She writes letters filled with religious encouragement. She sends gifts to relatives and children of former courtiers. She remembers birthdays. She continues to care. Perhaps this duality is what makes her so difficult to categorise. She's both the woman who signs death warrants and the woman who weeps when her dog dies. Both the queen who tried to turn the tide of English history and the daughter who never stopped mourning her mother's banishment. The contrast becomes clearest when you look at her spiritual life. Even in her final months, Mary attends Mass daily. She surrounds herself with priests and spiritual advisors, clinging to the rituals of her faith like a sailor to wreckage. Confession, communion, penance. They aren't just habits, they are her lifeline. She believes, truly believes, that her suffering has meaning, that her pain is a divine test, that her illnesses, her phantom pregnancies, her betrayals are all part of God's plan, and so she persists. In the early months of 1558, as her health deteriorates to the point where she can barely hold a quill, Mary begins preparing for death. She updates her will. She orders a modest funeral. She makes it known that she wants to be buried with her mother if possible. She prays not for a miracle, but for redemption. Her council grows uneasy. The question of succession looms. Privately, some urge her to name Elizabeth officially. Others hope she might choose a distant Catholic cousin, perhaps Mary, Queen of Scots. But time runs short. Mary drifts in and out of fever. Her speech slurs. She loses the ability to stand. One evening, in what some believe was her final moment of clarity, she asks simply, "Will God have mercy?" By November 17th, 1558, she is gone. The end is quiet. No dramatic final speech. No thundering storm. Just stillness. Elizabeth is proclaimed the Queen the very same day. The transition is swift, almost surgical. Within hours, royal standards are changed. Letters of state are redirected. The altars in the chapels are discreetly altered. Latin prayers are replaced with English. Mary's funeral, held at Westminster Abbey, is dignified but unremarkable. There is no national mourning, no outpouring of grief. Some say the people wept, not for the Queen, but for the weight lifted from their shoulders. In her will, Mary asks to be buried beside her mother. But in the end, she is laid to rest beneath the Lady Chapel, beneath a black stone marked only with her name. Years later, Elizabeth will be buried atop her. Their tomb, simple yet iconic, bears the Latin inscription, Regno consortes and urna, hic obdomimus Elizabetha et Maria Sororis, in spe resurrectionis. Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of resurrection. Sisters, yes, but uneasy ones, separated by faith, legacy, and time. And as England marches forward into its golden age of Protestant reform, Shakespearean drama, and empire building, Mary Tudor remains behind. Her figure slowly fading into myth, her face obscured by the smoke that came to define her. By the time Mary's coffin is lowered into the crypt at Westminster Abbey, her name is already changing shape in the minds of her people. The embers of her reign are still smouldering, literally in some towns, but the page is turning with deliberate haste. The court sheds its mourning garb quickly, as if eager to forget not just the Queen, but the years she governed. And in the market stalls and parish halls of England, a question begins to take root. How did we come to fear her so? The answer, as always, lies in stories. The burnings under Mary's reign are gruesome and unforgettable, yes, but they alone do not explain the depth of her posthumous vilification. It is not just what she did, it is what people believed she was capable of doing, and much of that belief, those images of Mary cackling at the pyre or weeping tears of blood, was shaped after her death by an unlikely weapon, the printing press. As Elizabeth takes the throne, a tide of Protestant exiles returns to England, bringing with them not just Geneva Bibles and reformist theology, but paper, ink, and stories. These are not impartial histories. They are accounts written by survivors, partisans, and preachers who lived through Mary's reign with fear in their bones and gospel in their pockets, and they are determined to make sure no one forgets what they saw, or what they believe they saw. At the centre of this narrative explosion stands one book in particular, Acts and Monuments, better known by its nickname, Fox's Book of Martyrs. Written by John Fox and published in 1563, This weighty volume becomes the cornerstone of Mary's historical reputation. Its pages are dense with stories of suffering, Protestant believers imprisoned, tortured, burned. It names names, dates events, records the last words of victims in painstaking detail. Some entries include woodcut illustrations, men and women bound to stakes, flames curling around their feet, faces turned heavenward in defiance. The effect is electric. In a world still navigating its identity, Fox offers a clear moral tale. Protestantism is light, Catholicism is shadow, and Mary? She becomes the human face of that darkness, the bloody queen, the tyrant in velvet, the woman who turned England into a living tomb. It's worth noting that Fox's book was not an obscure manuscript read by dusty scholars. It was published in large numbers, often chained in parish churches next to the Bible. Entire generations of English children grow up flipping its pages, their fingers tracing the flames, their imaginations scarred by the stories. Fox doesn't just influence public opinion, he becomes public opinion. And Mary, once a queen who dreamed of restoring faith and order, becomes an icon of horror. Of course, modern historians approach Fox's book with a more critical eye. Many of the stories are true in spirit, but not in every detail. Some executions are exaggerated. Others are dramatised for emotional impact. Fox, after all, was not writing history. He was writing theology. His goal was not to preserve the past, but to shape the future. And shape it he did. Mary's name soon becomes a byword for religious tyranny. The phrase, Bloody Mary, enters the English lexicon not just as a nickname, but as shorthand for any figure of excessive cruelty, particularly in religious matters. In ballads and plays, she is cast as a vengeful, barren queen, a foil to the witty, golden-haired Elizabeth. Her Catholicism is painted as sinister, her Spanish ties as treacherous, her femininity as fragile and unstable. She becomes the villain of England's Reformation narrative, and once a figure becomes a villain, she becomes useful. Throughout the reigns of James I and Charles I, Protestant preachers invoke her name in sermons to warn against backsliding. During the English Civil War, pamphleteers remind Puritan readers of the days when Papists ruled the land. Even in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the Catholic James II is deposed, Mary Tudor's ghost is summoned again as evidence that Catholic monarchs cannot be trusted. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's legend grows with each passing year. She's Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the monarch who defended England against Spain and ushered in an age of poetry, exploration, and pride. By contrast, Mary becomes little more than a warning label, and then, as time marches into the Enlightenment and beyond, something even stranger happens. Mary is no longer just a political figure, she becomes folklore. She slips into ghost stories, children's rhymes, and whispered tales told around candlelight. In one version, she's said to appear in mirrors if you chant her name 3 times. In another, she haunts abbeys and ruins, weeping for lost children or searching for her stillborn heirs. The historical queen becomes a spectre, a Gothic archetype, less a woman, more a shadow. But here's where the truth starts to pulse through the fog again, because even in the heart of all that legend, something real remains. The ache of her loneliness, the shape of her belief, the sincerity of her intentions. The more scholars dig into primary sources, letters, court records, ambassadorial reports, the more they find a woman who was not monstrous but tragic, a queen out of time. Mary was not a modern tyrant, but a medieval monarch living in a world sprinting toward modernity. She believed in hierarchy, in divine authority, in the power of ritual and penance. She thought the church could save the soul of the nation. And when that nation resisted, she turned to fire not because she was cruel, but because she thought she had no other choice. There's something hauntingly human in that. After all, how many of us cling to beliefs that no longer fit the world around us? How many fight to preserve what once gave us meaning, even as it crumbles? Mary did that. Not for power, not for wealth, but for the God she believed had called her. That doesn't excuse the burnings, but it complicates the image of the monster. It makes her a person again, a woman who suffered, a queen who failed, and perhaps, just perhaps, a soul who meant well. And still the stories swirl. In English pubs you can order a Bloody Mary cocktail thick with tomato and spice. Few stop to think about the name. In horror movies, teenagers chant it in front of bathroom mirrors, daring each other to summon a vengeful spirit. In textbooks, she is a footnote between Henry VIII's wild marital escapades and Elizabeth's golden reign. But in the quiet corners of history, the real Mary waits, not in smoke, not in blood, but in the yellowed letters where she asked Philip to come home, in the marginalia of her prayer books, in the cracked stone of her tomb shared with a sister who ruled the future she could not shape. She was not loved in her time, she was not remembered kindly after it, but she was real, and that in the end may be what matters most. The year is 1558. The burnings are still fresh in memory, the ash not yet swept from London's stones. But beneath the smoke-choked skies of Mary Tudor's England, something subtler is unfolding, a quiet inward struggle, less visible than flames but just as consuming. This isn't the drama of public martyrdoms or foreign alliances. This is the Queen's reckoning with the personal weight of her decisions. And within the hush of palaces and private chapels, the question begins to take root. Did she go too far? For a woman so deeply committed to her convictions, doubt creeps in only through the side door. Mary never publicly repents, never recants her religious policies. But behind her royal composure, signs of wear begin to show, not only in her failing body, but in the way her court whispers, the way advisers avoid her eyes, the way silence seems to follow her footsteps now more than reverence. Her reign, once filled with plans and processions, narrows into a quieter routine. Masses, audiences, and letters. Always letters, especially to Philip. His absence becomes more than physical, it becomes spiritual. She clings to him, not as a man perhaps, but as a symbol. His return is tied to everything. The chance for an heir, the restoration of joy, the vindication of her suffering. She continues writing, even when the replies slow, even when the tone cools to formality. To some around her, this obsession is painful to witness. They remember the radiant hope with which she awaited his first arrival, how she had filled her rooms with flowers, insisted the tapestries be changed to Spanish patterns, even ordered new gowns tailored to his tastes. That Mary, joyful and filled with dreams, has been whittled down to someone quieter, more brittle, draped in layers of black velvet, not just for modesty, but for armour. Meanwhile, the burnings continue. There is no singular turning point, no moment when public opinion definitively shifts against them. Instead, it's a cumulative tide. In small towns, as friends and neighbours vanish in the night, the fear turns to suspicion. What began as loyalty to Crown and Cross morphs into silent defiance. Villagers grow wary of strangers, avoid public prayers, skip holy days for fear of being misquoted or misjudged. Priests are watched, altars are searched, even children's toys, wooden saints, tiny crucifixes, are sometimes confiscated as evidence of papist sentiment. One strange detail, barely recorded in the official documents, tells of children in the Midlands playing a game called Flames and Faith. In it, one child is tied to a post while others chant verses. Then, just before the imaginary fire is lit, the group shouts a verdict, saved or condemned. It's morbid, yes, but it's telling. Mary's policies have not simply shaped religion, they've imprinted themselves on the psyche of an entire generation. And still, within her royal apartments, Mary persists. She begins to focus increasingly on theology, leaning on her confessor, Father Francis Mallet, for hours-long discussions about sin, grace and salvation. The questions she asks grow heavier, not abstract but personal. Can one who rules in righteousness yet cause pain? If the body sins to save the soul, who judges the fire? Is mercy weakness if it leads to eternal damnation? To her clergy, these are the queries of a deeply pious ruler. But to her closest ladies-in-waiting, those who see her weep at night, who bring her basin when she vomits bile, these are cries for reassurance, perhaps even forgiveness. Historians still argue whether Mary truly felt guilt over the executions. Some suggest she viewed the burnings as tragic but necessary, like pruning a diseased tree to save the orchard. Others believe her heart broke a little more with each fire lit, but there is no surviving diary, no confessional entry, no recorded moment of reversal, only silence, smoothed by ceremony. Meanwhile, at court, the political tide continues to turn. Elizabeth, who has survived arrest, interrogation, and years of quiet suspicion now finds herself positioned more securely than ever. She's careful, always careful, not to overstep, but her circle of allies grows. Even former supporters of Mary begin to whisper support for the younger Tudor. The burnings have made Elizabeth look not just like the heir, but the alternative, a future free of flames. And in that shifting court, another transformation is occurring. Mary's image, once revered, now becomes the subject of anxious metaphor. Court poets stop writing sonnets in her honour. Painters grow reluctant to take her likeness. Even the coinage, her name stamped beside Philip's, circulates with an edge of irony. Merchants joke that the value of a Mary penny changes with the wind. Her own subjects begin to erase her from their minds, even before her heart stops beating. And yet, there is one space where she is still honoured. In private chapels across England, particularly in older households loyal to the memory of her mother Catherine, candles continue to be lit for Mary's soul. Rosaries are said for her health. Children are named after her. Some speak her name with the reverence reserved for saints. To these faithful few, she is not Bloody Mary. She is Mary the Martyr, Mary the Restorer, the Queen who dared to reverse the clock and bring God back into England's blood. But they are a minority, a shrinking one. The majority, especially in cities, have turned. The executions have created a pantheon of Protestant saints, and with them, an ever-growing resistance. Fox's stories are already starting to circulate. Not printed yet, not formally collected, but told aloud. Around hearths, in whispered Latin, by returning exiles and sympathetic nobles, they tell of Latimer and Ridley, who died side by side in Oxford, of Anne Askew, tortured on the rack, then burned for refusing to denounce her beliefs, of elderly women tied to stakes beside their sons. These stories become legends, fueled by the very fires meant to stamp them out. And Mary, increasingly, becomes the symbol not of faith, but of fanaticism. She's rarely seen in public now. When she is, her appearance startles. Her once rosy cheeks are drawn and yellowed. Her hands, once steady in prayer, now tremble visibly. Even her voice, once described as gentle and melodic, has thinned to a whisper. Some courtiers say she speaks mostly in scripture now. Others note she flinches at loud sounds. A few whisper that she talks to shadows, and all the while Philip remains abroad. He writes, yes, but his letters are short, diplomatic, and increasingly impersonal. He thanks her for her devotion. He prays for her health, but he never promises to return. The dream of family, of dynasty, of a Catholic Tudor heir, that dream is gone. Even Mary knows it, and yet she does not quit. In her final acts as monarch, Mary funds several religious colleges. She donates land for new hospitals. She arranges for new translations of Catholic doctrine, hoping they might reach a future generation. These are not grand gestures, but they are meaningful. She still believes, if not in victory, then in seed planting, that something might grow from her ashes, but her people are already planting different seeds. In 1558, as her health fails, as her reign winds to a slow, creaking halt, the questions rise among her council. What now? Who next? How do we right this reign? And though Mary still breathes, still prays, still waits, her legacy is already being rewritten, firelight and all. As 1558 creeps toward its close, London holds its breath. The city is not mourning yet, but it waits with the nervous stillness of someone who hears coughing behind the door and knows what's coming. Mary Tudor, England's first reigning queen, is dying. Her courtiers know it. Her physicians know it. Even the people, hardened by years of smoke and sermons, can feel the weight shifting. But death, in Tudor England, isn't just personal, it's political. Every shiver of the Queen's candlelit chamber sends a tremor through the court. Who will succeed her? Will there be civil war? Will the new monarch undo everything she built? The answer is already obvious. Elizabeth waits just beyond the threshold, and the story of Mary, of Bloody Mary, is being shaped even before the crown cools on her brow. That shaping begins not with historians but with pamphleteers. As soon as Mary shows signs of decline, a quiet but feverish activity erupts in Protestant circles. Anonymous writers, emboldened by the Queen's impending demise, begin preparing broadsides that mix mourning with mockery. Rumours spread that she died childless because she killed children, that God struck her womb barren in judgment, that her illness is punishment for the fires she lit. In a way, she's being burned all over again, this time in words, and no one stokes the flame more effectively than the exiles. During Mary's reign, hundreds of English Protestants fled to the continent, settling in cities like Geneva, Zurich and Strasbourg. There they found refuge and, more dangerously, freedom to write. They publish open letters to England full of warnings and rebukes, condemning Mary's rule not only as tyrannical but unnatural. They describe her as warped by femininity, driven mad by unfulfilled motherhood, manipulated by Spanish interests. These men and women, once voiceless under Mary's censorship, now find their chorus, and it is not merciful. But it isn't just the foreign exiles who shape Mary's image, it's also the survivors. John Fox, a former tutor and devout Protestant, begins collecting testimonies from those who lived through the Marian persecutions. He writes with the urgency of someone documenting the apocalypse. His sources include refugees, jailers, even the occasional repentant informant. He gathers stories of prisoners starved in cold cells, of women who sang hymns through flames, of children orphaned by the pyres. Fox writes with passion, but not always precision. Many of his accounts are accurate in spirit but dramatised in detail. Dates are fudged, numbers are inflated, dialogue is invented for effect. Still, his readers don't mind. They're not looking for balance, they're looking for meaning, and in Fox's pages they find it. Mary becomes the great adversary of true religion, a female pharaoh, a Jezebel in velvet, a cautionary tale that history will never fully unwrite. It's worth noting that Fox himself once expressed a kind of strange sympathy for Mary, not for her policies, but for her suffering. He saw her as a woman destroyed by grief and fear. But the book that bears his name, Acts and Monuments, is not interested in complexity. It is a monument to Protestant identity, and Mary, she becomes its necessary monster. The phrase Bloody Mary appears not in her lifetime, but shortly after, in these early polemics. It's a nickname designed not just to insult, but to crystallise. It's memorable, brutal, and simple. Everything her reign, with all its contradictions, was not. Soon, the image sticks. In sermons, she's invoked as a warning. Beware the fires of Bloody Mary, a preacher might say, shaking his Bible in a smoke-wreathed parish. In school books, her reign is summarised in a single line. She burned the faithful and died without an heir. In taverns, her name becomes a punchline. In parlour games, children dare each other to whisper it thrice before a mirror. She's no longer a queen, she's a ghost. And Elizabeth, ever attuned to image and theatre, does nothing to stop this transformation. The new queen moves quickly to distance herself from her sister's policies. She reinstates the Book of Common Prayer. She restores the supremacy of the crown over the church. She declares her intent not to make windows into men's souls, a polite rebuke of Mary's invasive religious tests. But perhaps most importantly, she commissions portraits that show her not just as regal, but radiant, healthy, unmarried, untouchable. She is everything Mary was not, and she makes sure the people see it. Yet for all the contrast, Elizabeth does one thing that surprises even her closest advisers. She orders that she be buried in the same tomb as Mary. When asked why, she offers no explanation. Some suspect it's a gesture of reconciliation. Others think it a political move, a way to absorb Mary's symbolic power and neutralise her memory. Whatever the reason, the inscription on their shared tomb offers no hint of animosity. Just a plain Latin phrase, sisters, in hope of resurrection. And perhaps there is something profoundly English in that. This uneasy pairing of grace and grievance, unity and disunity, buried together in silence. Still, the public memory does not rest. Over the next century, Mary's story becomes the archetype for religious extremism. Whenever a Catholic monarch rises, Mary is invoked. When James II pushes too hard, Parliament remembers the Marian years. When Protestants feel threatened, they resurrect her name like a ward against tyranny. Ironically, this monstrous image gives her an afterlife more vivid than many of her more successful counterparts. Few outside academia remember Edward VI. Fewer still recall Jane Grey beyond her tragic 9 days. But Mary, she endures, not as she was, but as she was imagined, and this legacy evolves. In the 19th century, Amid Victorian obsessions with morality and maternal failure, Mary becomes a symbol of hysteria and misplaced female power. In some novels, she's described as a madwoman locked in her chambers, haunted by phantom children. In Gothic literature, she becomes the template for the tragic queen, the woman whose love and faith consume her. Always too much, always too alone. The 20th century isn't much kinder. In popular films and television, she's portrayed as pale, severe, and emotionally unstable. Rarely is she shown as young or kind. Rarely is her education or charity mentioned. The nickname has overtaken the woman. Even her most private griefs, her childlessness, her longing for Philip, are mined for drama. She becomes a case study in how monarchy can break the human spirit. And yet, there are glimmers of re-evaluation. Modern historians, especially in the last few decades, have begun pushing back against the caricature. They examine her policies with nuance, her personality with empathy. They point out that her father executed thousands more than she did, that Elizabeth's government also persecuted religious dissenters, that Mary's economic policies laid groundwork Elizabeth would later benefit from. They ask, fairly, if Mary had lived longer, might she have evolved? If she had been born a century earlier, might she have been canonised? But revision has limits. For better or worse, Mary's name remains entwined with flame. Her story is proof of how legacy can be shaped not by action alone, but by narrative, by who tells your story, by how you're remembered. And Mary's story for centuries was not told by those who knew her, but by those who survived her. Perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all. By the time Mary Tudor's life slips into shadow, her image has already been cemented in history books and public imagination as England's cautionary tale, a grim monarch wreathed in smoke, ever linked to fire and failure. But history is rarely so tidy, and while her enemies write much of what comes next, Mary does not entirely vanish. She lingers in the background of Elizabeth's reign, not physically, but spectrally, influencing the atmosphere, the politics, and the psychology of her successor's court. Elizabeth, though now triumphant, walks a political tightrope her sister never mastered, the balancing act between religious principle and public appeal. And Mary, in her tragic absolutism, becomes Elizabeth's permanent example of what not to do. At court, Mary is mentioned less and less. Her portraits are moved to side chambers or quietly removed. Statues commemorating her are quietly neglected. In the rare event that a noble invokes her memory, it is with careful phrasing, often as a contrast to current success. She becomes shorthand. Not another Mary becomes political slang for too much zeal, too little pragmatism. Yet Elizabeth does not entirely repudiate her sister. In private, some note she refers to Mary respectfully. Not warmly, not fondly, but with a formality that suggests a sense of shared burden. After all, both women had survived the worst of their father's court. Both had been declared illegitimate. Both had navigated a world hostile to women in power. Mary may have failed where Elizabeth succeeded, but Elizabeth knew all too well that failure was never far. Despite the political incentive to erase Mary, she remains fixed in the public consciousness, especially in the Catholic strongholds that persist across parts of northern England and Ireland. In Lancashire, Yorkshire, and Devon, Mary is still whispered about in a very different tone. In these regions, where Protestantism took root more slowly, families speak of Queen Mary, with something like reverence, not in rebellion, but in mourning. Her image is preserved in rosaries and prayer cards smuggled in from France and Spain. A few brave priests even refer to her in sermons, calling her a queen of the true faith. Some households reportedly kept portraits of Mary hidden behind cupboard doors, revealed only during secret masses. She becomes a symbol not of terror, but of loyalty, a spiritual queen to a spiritual underground. Outside England, especially in Catholic Europe, Mary is remembered more generously. In Spain and Rome, she is praised for her piety and her unshakable fidelity to the Pope. To the Vatican, Mary remains one of the few monarchs who attempted a full-scale recatholicization of a Protestant realm. Though she failed, her intent is honoured. Popes after her death speak of her purity of purpose. Catholic historians in France refer to her as La Reine Fidèle, the faithful queen. In Habsburg courts, her marriage to Philip is remembered more as an act of alliance than affection, but still regarded with strategic admiration. But no narrative is immune to evolution. By the 17th century, England is gripped by its next great religious crisis, the English Civil War. And in the tumult, Mary's name returns once more, not in fact, but in fear. Puritan pamphleteers, eager to reinforce Protestant identity, resurrect the image of Bloody Mary to terrify new generations. They reprint Fox's accounts. They add new horrors, some entirely fabricated, of secret Catholic plots and imagined royal tortures. Mary becomes less a queen and more a bogeyman, an emblem of what might happen if England slips back toward Rome. During the reign of James II, a Catholic king who tries to loosen restrictions on Catholic worship, Mary's name surfaces again, this time weaponised. Protestant leaders paint him as a new Mary in masculine form. Anti-Catholic riots erupt across London. In effigy, Mary and James are sometimes burned together, as if to erase the very possibility of Catholic rule. This political use of Mary's legacy, stretching from real memory to mythic utility, shapes not just English identity, but English law. The Act of Settlement in 1701, which ensures that no Catholic may ever sit on the English throne, is drafted with Mary's reign still echoing in the minds of lawmakers. They remember, or think they remember, what Catholic monarchy brought, and they decide never again. But history, like fire, has a way of consuming everything in its path, including nuance. As the Enlightenment dawns, Mary is rarely studied as a ruler. More often, she is referenced as a symbol of what goes wrong when emotion rules logic, when faith trumps law, when women overstep their boundaries. The philosopher David Hume, writing in the 18th century, refers to her as a woman of no judgment, dismissing her reign with the sweep of a sentence. Others call her unwomanly, unmotherly, unnatural. This portrayal has less to do with her policies than with her gender. Mary is remembered not simply as a failed queen, but as a failed woman, a queen who married for alliance, not affection, a wife who was not desired, a mother who never bore a child. Her womb, rather than her laws, becomes the centrepiece of her memory. Yet in private circles, particularly among Catholic families and scholars, efforts to rehabilitate her image never entirely fade. Small biographies emerge in Italy, Spain and France describing her faith and endurance. One Jesuit priest in the 1760s refers to her as a rose among thorns, choked but not broken. These writings rarely reach English readers, but they exist, and they plant seeds. It isn't until the 20th century that academic historians in England begin to revisit Mary with fresh eyes. The early feminist movement, followed by broader historical revisionism, prompts a re-evaluation of figures like her, women whose reputations were shaped more by their gender and their enemies than by objective review. E.A. Freeman, a Victorian historian, was among the first to openly criticise Fox's bias. Later scholars like H.F.M. Prescott and Jasper Ridley would build more balanced portraits, acknowledging the brutality of her reign, yes, but also its sincerity, its unintended tragedy. They remind readers that Mary inherited a broken kingdom, economically drained, religiously splintered, politically volatile, that her task was near impossible, that she tried and failed, but not without reason. They examine her attempts at economic stabilisation, her reforms to the currency, her cautious foreign policy. They explore her belief that spiritual unity would bring political peace. They note that even Elizabeth, in her early years, relied on policies and frameworks Mary had established. Still, even the most sympathetic accounts struggle against the gravity of her legend. The name Bloody Mary is a gravitational force unto itself, a label so heavy, so loaded, that it compresses the person beneath it. It becomes nearly impossible to talk about Mary Tudor without invoking the nickname, even to refute it. It has passed into idiom, into drink menus, into mirror games. It has become folklore, and folklore does not bend easily to fact. Yet despite all this, despite the pamphlets and portraits and centuries of scorn Mary endures, perhaps not as she would have liked, certainly not as a beloved monarch, but as a question, a challenge, a ghost in the margins of England's golden age. She is the woman who lit fires because she believed she was saving souls, the queen who stood against the tide and drowned in it, the monarch whose face we cannot look at clearly, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it reminds us we might have done in her place, and maybe in the end that's why she still matters. The light that flickers at the edge of Mary Tudor's legacy is not from pyres anymore. It's from candles lit centuries later by those still wondering how her reign unravelled into infamy. Her story remains an object lesson, dissected in textbooks and whispered across time, but her humanity is often what vanishes first, and nowhere is that clearer than in the story of Elizabeth. For as much as Elizabeth's reign is remembered for brilliance, Shakespeare, Sea Dogs, the Spanish Armada, it is shaped just as profoundly by the shadow of her sister. Elizabeth does not inherit a blank canvas, she inherits scorched earth, and what she builds upon it reflects both gratitude and rejection. Where Mary ruled from the altar, Elizabeth rules from the stage. From the beginning, Elizabeth presents herself not just as a monarch, but as an image, a performance of power. Her coronation is crafted like a theatrical production, blending Protestant rhetoric with traditional pageantry. The people cheer her not only for what she promises to be, but for what she is not. She is not Mary. She is not fire and gallows. She is light. But Elizabeth is no fool. She knows how fine the line is between legacy and legend, so she controls her image ruthlessly. Portraits are carefully curated, never old, never ill. Her virginity becomes symbol and shield. Her speeches are remembered less for their facts than their cadence. And through it all, Mary is rarely mentioned, except when needed. When dissenters rise or Catholic threats loom, especially in the form of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's counsellors remind the public what happened the last time a devout Catholic ruled. The burnings are revived in print. Fox's book sees reprints with even more dramatic woodcuts. Bloody Mary becomes an alarm bell, a ghost story to frighten the faithful into obedience. Elizabeth never directly uses the phrase, but she never denounces it either. Instead, she enshrines Mary where she wants her, beneath her. In 1603, when Elizabeth dies and her body is carried to Westminster, her tomb is constructed atop Mary's. It is a symbolic gesture no matter how you read it. Some say it is magnanimous, a final gesture of familial unity. Others say it's triumphal, a literal expression of Elizabeth's victory. Either way, the inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of resurrection." But only Elizabeth's effigy is carved in stone. Mary's image is absent. That alone speaks volumes. Still, in the dark corners of cathedrals and in private libraries, Mary's defenders persist. Over the next 2 centuries, a trickle of Catholic writers attempts to restore her dignity. Jesuit scholars frame her as a saint of lost causes. In Spain and parts of Italy, she is referred to as Maria de Inglaterra, England's last hope for true faith. But their words rarely travel. The dominant narrative remains unshaken. In England, her name is shorthand for the wrong kind of queen. When the Glorious Revolution of 1688 replaces the Catholic James II with the Protestant William and Mary, the new regime is careful to emphasise continuity with Elizabeth, not with Mary Tudor. Statues of Elizabeth go up. Paintings of Mary vanish from public buildings. Protestant England has its mythology, and Mary does not fit. Yet there are cracks. By the early 19th century, a new sensibility emerges. Romanticism, with its love of tragedy and complex heroines, opens the door to more sympathetic readings. Writers like Agnes Strickland and later H.F.M. Prescott begin to re-examine Mary's life not through the lens of religious politics, but of personal struggle. They portray her not just as a queen, but as a daughter, a woman, a survivor. And here, at last, her story begins to bend. Not erase the flames, but soften the image of the woman who lit them. They write of her early promise, the bright girl fluent in Latin and music, beloved by both her mother and her court, of her fall from grace, declared illegitimate, separated from Catherine, humiliated by Henry's new queens, of her long years in political limbo and exile in her own country, and then of her triumphant return. That brief summer when she seized the crown from Jane Grey's usurpers, when the people lined the streets not in fear but in cheers. They remind us that for a few bright months, Mary Tudor was loved, not by all but by enough. That in the beginning she was not yet Bloody Mary, just Mary, the rightful heir. These biographies don't ignore the burnings. They acknowledge them, grapple with them, but they place them within context, of the time, of her trauma, of her sincere belief that she was saving souls. They present a woman not easy to like, perhaps, but impossible to ignore. And still, the culture struggles with nuance. In the 20th century, even as academic circles re-evaluate her reign, pop culture does not. Films portray her as deranged, shrieking, haunted. In one, she is pale and wide-eyed, whispering to dolls. In another, she claws at her belly, imagining children that never existed. These depictions are not critiques, they are caricatures. The drink named after her doesn't help. The Bloody Mary, vodka, tomato juice, Tabasco, has no direct connection to the Queen, but the name cements her in pop consciousness as something both grotesque and trivial. A joke at brunch, a game in a bathroom mirror. Her name becomes untethered from her life. Yet beneath the jokes and the smoke, Mary endures. In every conversation about female leadership, she reappears, not as a role model, but as a warning. The woman who ruled with her heart instead of her head. The woman who loved too hard, believed too fiercely, suffered too openly. And whether we see her as victim, villain, or something in between, we cannot look away. She remains, always, the one who tried to undo history, who turned her face toward a past she could not restore, who ruled not with charm or compromise, but with the conviction that salvation was worth any price. And though her name will forever conjure fire, perhaps in its embers we can see something else. Not a perfect queen, but a human one. A woman who made terrible mistakes, not out of malice, but out of belief. Who fought for a vision of England that had already begun to vanish. And who, in trying to save her country's soul, lost her place in its heart. As England strides confidently into the reign of Elizabeth I, gilded with triumphs and literary flourishes, the memory of Mary Tudor seems to evaporate. Or at least that's how the story is often told. But like smoke trapped in the rafters of a long-burned house, she lingers in ways both subtle and profound. Her absence becomes a kind of presence. Her failure becomes the mould from which future success is carefully cast. Because to truly understand Mary's legacy, one must look not just at how she was remembered, but at what she left behind. For all the fire and fury associated with her name, Mary was not a ruler without foresight. In fact, many of the institutional structures that flourished under Elizabeth found their first footing under Mary's hand. Take the financial reforms. When Mary ascended the throne in 1553, the royal finances were in disarray. Her father, Henry VIII, had depleted much of the treasury in wars and extravagant spending. The coinage was heavily debased, literally watered down with cheaper metals, causing rampant inflation. Though Mary is often remembered for her religious policies, one of her most pragmatic achievements was the overhaul of the currency. She initiated plans to recall and reissue coins at proper weight and purity, a plan her advisors, notably William Paulet and Thomas Gresham, would continue to refine. These reforms wouldn't fully take root until Elizabeth's reign, but they began with Mary. It was her council that first acknowledged the economic rot and made hard choices to address it. And then there were the naval investments. Often forgotten is that Mary, despite her inland focus, helped lay the groundwork for England's future maritime strength. During her reign, steps were taken to restore royal docks, particularly at Portsmouth, and to improve naval administration. These early moves ensured that when Elizabeth later launched her navy against the Spanish Armada, the foundation had already been laid. She also made strides in public welfare. Mary's reign saw renewed interest in social care, particularly in urban centres. She re-established several hospitals dissolved during the Reformation, St Bartholomew's in London among them, providing much-needed relief to the poor and sick. Her commitment to charity was genuine, and her policies reflected a queen who saw care for the vulnerable as a divine duty. Even in education, her fingerprints endure. She supported the endowment of seminaries and colleges, many of which laid the groundwork for future Catholic, and in some cases Protestant scholars. Her emphasis on clerical education, though framed in the language of orthodoxy, underscored a belief in an educated clergy and moral governance. And yet, these contributions are rarely credited to her. Why? Because the narrative of Mary Tudor had already been drafted by the time her body cooled in the tomb. A narrative that prioritised her failures, especially the burnings, and turned her achievements into footnotes. But the story doesn't end with policies, it also lives in people. Consider Reginald Pole, the last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. He was Mary's spiritual partner in many ways, tasked with orchestrating the restoration of Catholic rights and healing the fracture between England and Rome. Pole was deeply learned, humane, and cautious by nature, a striking contrast to the fiery zealotry often attributed to the era. Pole's tenure didn't last long. He died hours after Mary herself, but his influence on religious moderation, yes, even in such a fraught time, hints at what Mary's vision could have become had she lived longer. A kingdom not defined solely by the stake, but by a steady return to ancient faith, tempered by learning and grace. There are, too, the less official legacies, those written not in law but in the lives of individuals. Midwives and nuns, long suppressed by the Reformation, found space to re-emerge under Mary. Women, especially those of religious orders, were welcomed back into service. Convents were re-established. While these efforts were short-lived, they reawakened an idea of feminine spiritual authority that had been systematically erased under her father. And then there's the question of what might have been. Had Mary produced an heir, especially a male Catholic heir, everything might have changed. England may have remained a Catholic nation. The Reformation may have stalled or taken a different shape. The Elizabethan Golden Age, so celebrated now, may have looked more like the Habsburg courts of Spain or Austria. It's a tantalising what-if, one that historians still debate. Some argue England's Protestant destiny was inevitable, shaped by broader European currents. Others contend that Mary stood at a genuine crossroads, and her failure to bear a child sealed that path shut. But what if the question isn't about destiny? What if it's about timing? Mary ruled for just over 5 years, a blink in monarchical terms. 5 years to reverse 2 decades of reform, 5 years to persuade a divided people, 5 years to win the love of a country already falling out of love with Latin, incense, and saints. That she failed isn't shocking. That she tried so fiercely, so unwaveringly, that's what lingers. Her legacy, then, is as much emotional as political. She was England's first Queen Regnant, after all, the first woman to rule in her own right, not as consort but as sovereign. And while Elizabeth would come to personify that role in golden iconography, it was Mary who first bore the crown's full weight, who weathered the doubts, the resistance, the whispering slander about a woman's place on the throne. She proved, if nothing else, that a woman could reign, that she could command armies, issue laws, negotiate with emperors, resist rebellions, and speak from a throne without flinching. And she did all this without precedent. No mother, no mentor, no model. Just the memory of her exiled, sainted mother, and the lessons she learned from survival. In the end, Mary's reign is remembered as an era of fear. But her legacy, messy, painful, deeply human, asks us not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Not for sainthood, but for recognition. She was not England's worst monarch. She was its most misunderstood. She governed not from cruelty, but from conviction. And while that conviction led her into tragedy, it also made her remarkable. She was the daughter of Henry VIII, the wife of Philip II, the sister of Elizabeth I, but she was never simply someone else's footnote. She was Queen Mary I, and she deserves to be remembered as such. In the final years of her life, Mary Tudor becomes less of a monarch and more of a reflection of what was, what might have been, and what will never be. She moves through the cold stone halls of St. James's Palace like a faded spectre, still technically ruling but already being folded out of history. Her voice, once timid but certain, now trembles in the silence between prayers. Her letters, written in ever more delicate script, grow shorter. Her steps are slower, and her meetings with the Privy Council become more ceremonial than influential. And all around her, England waits for her to die. It is a cruel truth, but a truth nonetheless. Courtiers begin aligning with Elizabeth. Ambassadors report daily health updates back to their governments. Even her household, those who attend her meals and pour her wine, begin using past tense too soon. They say the Queen was fond of this, they say. The Queen liked her garden. The was hangs in the air, Mary hears it, and she knows. In her final weeks, as her illness sharpens, the scope of her reign narrows to a series of small gestures. She refuses strong drink, but accepts thin broth. She attends Mass from her bed, lips moving slowly to the rhythm of the priest's chants. Her rosary becomes a permanent fixture in her hand, each bead worn smooth from worry and use. Visitors are fewer. Her rooms are quieter. the world contracts, and then, on the 17th of November, 1558, she dies. No thunder shakes the skies, no saints descend. Just a breath, a stillness, and a whisper. Some say she murmured Philip as her last word. Others believe it was Jesus. What is certain is that she slipped into the silence she had feared and prepared for all her life. And just like that, the crown moved on. Elizabeth ascends and England exhales. The mourning period is observed, but not felt. Bells toll, but not with sorrow. The streets do not fill with grief, but with speculation. What will the new queen do? How soon will the mass be banned again? Will there be vengeance for the fires? Mary's funeral is dignified but uncelebrated. She's laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, in the same stone vault that will later hold her sister. Atop her, Elizabeth will be entombed. Above them, the inscription, "Partners in throne and grave." But only Elizabeth's effigy is carved. Mary's name is there, but her image is not. A fitting symbol, perhaps, of how her legacy would be written. Present, but overshadowed. And then the work of myth-making begins in earnest. Elizabeth, with the cunning of a politician and the theatricality of a poet, allows Mary's reputation to fall, not with loud condemnation, but with careful neglect. She lets others speak for her. Let Fox write, let the preachers preach. Let Mary become the villain in their sermons and morality plays. Elizabeth does not speak ill of her sister, but she never defends her either. She doesn't need to. Time and a little guidance will do the job. And so Mary becomes Bloody Mary, a name she never heard in life, but one that clings to her in death like smoke on fabric. It is a name that erases nuance, that simplifies, that satisfies those who prefer history tidy. It's not just unfair, it's inaccurate. Because Mary was not monstrous. She was complex, a queen shaped by trauma, driven by faith, and undone not by malice, but by an unyielding need to restore what had been lost. Her actions were harsh, often horrifying. But they were rooted in a vision, not of tyranny, but of salvation. She believed, until her final breath, that she was saving England's soul. And that belief, more than anything, made her dangerous. History remembers winners, but it never forgets the ones who bleed. And Mary bled, in silence, in prayer, in disappointment. She bled for a marriage that gave her no joy. She bled for a faith that abandoned her in the eyes of her people. She bled for a child who never came, for a crown that weighed her down more than it lifted her up. But perhaps her most tragic wound was this: she ruled before her time. A Catholic queen in a country leaning Protestant. A woman ruler before the people were ready. A monarch who believed too deeply in something the nation no longer shared. She ruled not with cruelty, but with certainty. And in the end, it was that certainty, unquestioning, uncompromising, that cost her everything. And so, her tomb remains. Quiet, unvisited by many, passed over by tourists who flock to see Elizabeth's effigy above. They run fingers over the carved robes of the Virgin Queen, pose for photographs, and seldom glance down to where Mary lies beneath. But if you stop, if you pause in that marble silence and close your eyes, you might sense her still there, clutching her rosary, whispering a Latin prayer, waiting for a redemption history has yet to grant her. Because maybe in the end Bloody Mary wasn't so bloody after all. Maybe she was just the wrong woman, in the wrong century, fighting for a world that no longer wanted her. And maybe that's the saddest story history ever tells. And so, dear listener, we slip gently from the firelit corridors of Tudor England and into the quiet stillness of night. The story of Mary Tudor has wound its long candle-dappled path, not with the triumphs of gold and glory, but with the fragile threads of belief, loss, and legacy. She came into the world beneath banners of celebration, was crowned amid cautious hope, and died beneath a cloud of hushed prayers and reluctant goodbyes. Whatever history says, she ruled. She endured betrayal, exile, humiliation and illness, and still stood tall beneath a crown that few thought she could hold. She prayed when no one listened. She loved when no one returned it. And though her reign ended in silence, her story did not. The world she tried to restore faded long before she did. But in the quiet corners of chapels, in the margins of old books, and even in the twisted echoes of legend, her name remains. not just as a nickname or an effigy, but as a reminder. That history is not made only by the victorious, but by the ones who tried, the ones who believed, the ones who bore the burden of belief so heavy it broke them. So now, as your eyes begin to grow heavy, let the echoes fade, let the candles dim. Picture not the pyres or the portraits, but a quiet chapel, one woman kneeling in the dark, whispering a final prayer. May her story rest with you tonight,